foundations, shore up the framing, and swap out any rotting beams or walls to align with state building codes. The roof needed reshingling, all the doors and windows would need resealing, and the whole place needed a massive utilities overhaul, including an HVAC replacement. Inside, I'd need to insulate the walls and attic, refinish the wooden floors, make sure all the bathroom fixtures were in good working order, and all after securing the right permits from the county courthouse. And all in all, it was looking like a 3 to 6 month job that had set the owner back between $50,000 and $100,000 or possibly more. And so as you can imagine, I accepted the contract pretty much there and then and signed it after 2 quick read-throughs to make sure everything was up to code. Now I drove out to the place on a Monday morning, having signed the contract and received the keys on the Friday before. It was a big job, so I was pretty excited to get started, but when I arrived, I found out that my key didn't work. Now, I think I just rolled my eyes, then took out my phone to give him a call, but since it was pretty early in the morning, I was neither surprised nor annoyed when he didn't answer. I left a message on his voicemail asking him to call me back because he'd given me the wrong key. I wasn't rude about it, I just said it like it was, and how I'd appreciate if he could get me the real key as soon as humanly possible. Now, being there wasn't a complete waste of time because I could still survey the building's exterior and get a real feel for what I was dealing with. So for about the next half hour or so, that's what I did. Right up until a black SUV came tearing up the road behind me, and a guy dressed in a security uniform got out of it. He asked if I had permission to be on the land, so I explained who I was and why I was there. Now, once I explained I was the contractor, he softened up a little, but went on to explain how I couldn't be there just yet because the safety inspectors hadn't been around yet. Now, I thought I was doing the safety evaluation, but he went back to his truck to grab the paperwork for me. And then, since it all looked legitimate, with the name of the owner on there and everything, I got back in my truck and drove back into town. Now, I was having lunch by the time the client called me back, and while I figured it'd be a simple case of getting me the right key, it was anything but. He sounded annoyed when I picked up the phone and insisted that he had indeed given me the correct key. Now, I very calmly assured him that wasn't the case, but it was easily rectified, especially since he had a whole week before the safety inspectors could finish their work. Now, the client immediately says, "What safety inspectors?" And so I explained the whole encounter with the security guard that he'd hired. And once again, the client immediately responded with, "What security guard?" And this was when I realized something weird was going on. I told the client as much and how from experience there was probably some kind of illegal activity occurring in his vacant property. He sighed, then asked if I could meet him out at the house the following morning with a locksmith and a sheriff's deputy. The next morning, I did the same thing as the first and arrived at the vacant house around 8 a.m. And then over the next 10 to 20 minutes, the client, the locksmith, and the deputy rolled up one by one. The client goes over the situation with the deputy and the locksmith, just making sure that they're up to speed about what he might be facing inside. Then, once that was all out of the way, the locksmith got the door open and the deputy let us inside. And the first thing that struck me was how clean the place was. It was still run down and I could see a bunch of junk and old dusty furniture in one of the rooms, but the hallway looked like it had been swept meticulously, as did one of 4 rooms on the ground floor. But when the deputy walked into that room, he saw something that had him calling it in on his radio just a few seconds later. It was a chair, a metal one, and it looked like it had been bolted to the floor. It wasn't alone either. There was a bunch of chains piled up in one corner, and the deputy mentioned that too when he made his dispatch call. It was obvious that something bad had been happening there. Something really bad by the looks of things. We just didn't understand the extent of it, not until we got upstairs and saw what had been done to the shower cubicle. Now, the bathtub was in one corner, and the shower was in the other, and much like the hallway in the room downstairs, it looked like someone had taken a great amount of care in cleaning the place down. But that's not what stopped me in my tracks. What had my mouth open in shock and horror was the fact that someone had reinforced the shower cubicle with concrete slabs, and these concrete slabs looked like they had bullet holes in them. Not all the way through bullet holes, but almost like damage where bullets had hit the concrete. And as soon as he saw that, the deputy told us that we better go back outside because the place was almost certainly now some kind of crime scene. We just did as he asked and walked back outside in silence, and with this chill in the air despite that Texas heat. We knew we'd just been someplace where folks had been hurt and then killed, and there was no telling just how many folks that had happened to either. And it all made sense why the place was so clean too, at least the rooms people were using for their business there, and why they'd most likely been scrubbed down during the previous 24 hours following my first visit to the place. Now there was a real sense of they were just here, which only added to how damned creepy it all was, and I'll never forget the look on that deputy's face either, like he'd never seen anything like that before. The poor guy figured he was going to chase out some squatters and ended up walking around a freaking torture and execution chamber. And as you can probably guess, renovations were delayed until the cops could comb the house over for any evidence. But they didn't find a lick of it inside those four walls, and they didn't find anything around the property either, especially digging the place up so much that it looked like the surface of the moon. Just craters everywhere. I obviously wasn't told crap by the cops, I was just the contractor. But when it came time for the job to start back up again, the client filled me in on what they told him. And like I said, the cops didn't find anything. But based on how clean the place was in relation to how run down the home was, it was likely the house had been occupied during my first visit. And when I tried to unlock the door, there had been torturers and murderers inside, and maybe even victims too. And that gave me a whole second helping of all that creepy, they were just here feeling. Only as you can imagine, it was way worse that time, thinking that I'd been so close to such terrible evil, and it had been quietly lurking inside, while I'd been completely none the wiser. As a younger man, I was a Texas Ranger for the better part of 2 decades, and in that time, I saw and heard things that would quite literally haunt a man until he's lying in his grave. But out of all of those things, there's only one that haunts me more than most, and that creeps into my mind on those cold and lonely nights when I wonder if I ever really made a true difference. It was the early 80s, I was a much younger man, and I was essentially working as an understudy to a veteran ranger who had a heck of a lot of wisdom to impart to me. Then one day, we were asked to go visit a guy named Wolf, Paul Wolf, to ask him about his wife's ex-husband. A Mr. Billy Staton and his current partner had been missing for a few days, having apparently last been seen paying a visit to Mr. Wolf's house. Mr. Wolf was by that time married to Mr. Staton's ex-wife and had shared custody of Staton's daughter, Melody. He also didn't think her father treated her very well, most likely on account of his wife talking trash about him when he wasn't around. Wolf would sometimes become aggressive with Billy Staton whenever he showed up to pick up his daughter, sometimes very aggressive. And so Mr. Staton decided that he's going to slip a small tape recorder into his pocket prior to pickup so he can prove to a judge just how hostile Wolf really was. Now, when we arrived at Wolf's home, he claimed no knowledge of Staton's visit. He said Staton and his fiancée, a lady named Letitia Castro, hadn't been by in almost a week, and since they hadn't stopped by to exchange custody, they just kept hold of little Melanie until they decided to show. Now, we knew that wasn't the case, so we knew that we caught him in a lie, and that was all the grounds we needed to arrest him on suspicion of murder. And then, surprise, surprise, once he was in custody, Mr. Wolf changed his tune and admitted that Staton and Castro had stopped by his place. He started claiming that upon trying to remove his daughter from the property, Staton became forceful and started yelling at her. Wolf said he stepped in and tried to calm Staton down, but Staton began yelling and shoving him away. A fight broke out, but while Wolf was merely trying to restrain the angry Staton, Staton was straight up trying to murder him. Wolf said he tried, and he tried, yelling for his wife, Staton's ex, to call the cops, but Staton overpowered him and forced him to escalate. Wolf said that in order to save his own life, his wife's life, and the life of her daughter, he began striking Mr. Staton around the head with an iron bar. Now, he said he blacked out, like the red mist had descended on him, and then when he woke up, Mr. Staton and his fiancée were dead. Wolf said that in a panic, he threw the 2 bodies into the back of his truck and then drove out to a nearby river to dump them. He told us where the spot was, so we drove out to see if he was telling the truth. It turns out the bodies were exactly where he said they'd be, bloated and half rotten from laying there in lukewarm river water. But I guess Wolf was counting on the bodies being too rotten to really analyze, because when we found them, Miss Castro's corpse showed that she'd been shot in the head at close range and was something of a large caliber. Now, this directly contradicted Wolf's story, as he insisted only the metal bar was used to defend himself and his family. But that wasn't the only thing that proved Wolf was lying, because when we dragged Billy Statton's body out of the water, we found something hidden on his person. A small tape recorder with a tape still inside it. And since restoring that kind of tech was way beyond our capabilities, we sent the tape over to the FBI lab in Washington to see if they could pull anything off of it. The tape was actually moldy at the time, and you'd think that we'd have dried it out and cleaned it off before sending it, but according to the folks over at the lab, drying it out was the worst thing that we could do to it. And we ended up mailing it to them in a little plastic jar of water, and then a couple of weeks later, they mailed us back a fully working copy of the original. And the audio wasn't exactly crystal clear, but it was clear enough to make out individual voices, as well as what they were saying, and what they were saying contradicted Paul Wolf's entire story. Now, right away, we could tell his story had been a bold-faced lie, almost right from the jump. It's possible to hear Mr. Statton asking his daughter to come with him, at which point she began to cry. Now, we figured this lined up with what Wolf had said about Statton being such a poor father that his daughter dreaded being in his company. But as she cried, he wasn't angry or aggressive with her. He merely attempted to calm and console what sounded like a tired and cranky kid. Yet as Mr. Statton tried to calm his daughter, it was Wolf who became aggressive, and then after what sounded like a brief struggle, a series of very deep thumps can be heard. The next you hear is that Mrs. Wolf, Billy Statton's ex, who begins yelling, "Get him! Hurry up and get him!" Mrs. Wolf then yells, "Hit him again," and then the front door. And that last part was in reference to the fact that Miss Castro was trying to escape. Somebody ran to block the door, and then Miss Castro's life was ended too. Mrs. Wolf then begins yelling, "Get him up! Get him out of here!" At which point Mr. Wolf enlisted the help of one Glenn Henderson, who later confessed to his part in disposing of the bodies and was sentenced to life in prison. Sometime later, apparently during the cleanup process, Paul Wolf can be heard saying, "Ah, damn it, Glenn, look at the mess you made." And we later found out that Mr. Henderson had failed to actually wrap one set of remains, and while lifting up to carry it out of the house, a large amount of blood leaked onto the hallway carpet. And this ended up being a crucial piece of evidence even after the Wolves hired an industrial-grade vacuum cleaner to try and get rid of it, and we ended up putting both Paul Wolf and his wife away for a very long time. Now, during my time in the Rangers, I came to witness a lot of very disturbing crime scenes, but we get there when it's all over and the dust has settled. We occasionally watch pieces of security camera footage, and I understand that these days they come with sound and color, but back then, it was all black and white and grainy, and it ran like a silent movie. I realized that I'd seen a lot of dead people, and I'd seen quite a number receive fatal injuries. I just never heard anyone die before, so the sound Billy Statton made on the tell-all recording, that groan that he let out as his skull was being caved in, I think it might haunt me for the rest of my natural life. I was raised in West Texas, a trailer park by a single mom, and the rest is summed up by a couple of lines from a Merle Haggard song. "Dear old daddy, rest his soul, left my mom a heavy load. She tried so very hard to fill his shoes, working hours without rest, wanted me to have the best. She tried to raise me right, but I refused." People said my daddy was wild, and I guess I sprung from that same bad seed. But while my buddies were picking poisons like dope or booze or women, I got hooked on something altogether different: adrenaline. I was a junkie for it ever since I stood up to my middle school bully. He beat 7 shades of crap out of me, but I landed the sweetest right hook right on his fat face before he did, and afterwards, I felt so good I could have strut sitting down. He didn't bother me anymore after that, and I didn't see enough high school for anyone else to make the same mistake. But when I heard my little cousin was being hassled at high school, I just about jumped at the chance to trim some tail feathers, so to speak. And that, ladies and germs, was the first time I robbed anybody. My freshman cousin had a toy cap gun shaped like a pearl handle revolver, and it was his pride and joy, but I guess it was his own damn fault for taking a toy into high school because he got it snatched off of him almost right away. He kept his trap shut about it for weeks, so by the time I found out, there was no getting the cap gun back. But when I found the bully, I made him empty his pockets, I took his sneakers, and I even took the shirt off his damn back. And that was an even bigger rush than socking my bully in his fat, pudgy face. And I guess that was my career decider right there. The way other kids see a Marine in his dress blues or a roughneck manhandling his rig and think, damn, that's what I want to be when I grow up. I robbed that kid and I thought, hell, I could get used to this. And I started off in earnest when I was 16, stealing cars and robbing houses so I wouldn't have to get a real job. And then by the time I started hanging out in bars and meeting the right people, I got involved in much more organized sorts of crime. I started robbing trucks with a guy who called himself TJ because all we had to do was wait to see which truckers picked up a lot lizard and then raid their cargo when the cab was shaking. And that made us some good money for a while, but as we got older and started racking up bills, we needed to graduate to something a little more rewarding. We started robbing gas stations, bars, and pawn shops, anything that would net us a clean 4 or 5 figures if we hit the safe on deposit day. And then as we started hitting bigger and bigger places, we brought on a guy called Jody for crowd control. Now this was my crew for about 3 years, and we'd hit a place maybe once every couple of months if conditions were just right. But then for this one job of robbing a small credit union, Jody wasn't available, and after shopping around, TJ said that he'd found a replacement in the form of a guy named Vincent. Before we did anything with Vincent, I wanted a face-to-face, and so we met for some steak and potatoes over at this little place outside of Odessa. And TJ said that he was a big guy, pretty sharp too, meaning that he'd be the perfect replacement for Jody while he was out of state. And then when he walked through the door of that steak place, I couldn't have agreed more. The guy was terrifying, not just because of how big he was, and he had to be scraping at least 7 feet with his boots on, but because of the way he carried himself, like he was meaner than a skillet full of rattlesnakes. I'm not easy to frighten, but having Vincent sitting across from me with his long and wild-looking beard, it had me feeling like Dobby in a glue trap. He had this way of looking at you that felt like he was peeking right into your head, just sort of quietly figuring you out. Vincent said he had some military experience, just not with the U.S. military, and that he had connections in the Aryan nations after doing a little time over in New Mexico. He didn't have a problem working in a crew, and he didn't mind doing things our way if we organized the job right. And the only thing that struck me as sketchy was when he said that he couldn't talk about the time that he served in that other country's military. That kind of set off my bullcrap detector, but if all we needed him to do was stand there and look mean, then he'd be just fine. We ended up hitting this little credit union about a week later, and unlike a lot of the bigger unions or bank chains, the manager proved a tough nut to crack. A teller in a big bank chain is just there to collect a paycheck, but a small-town credit union manager, that's his whole life that you're stamping on. He knows his customers, they're his neighbors, and he likes them too. But what he doesn't like is no-account robbers like us thinking that we can have something for nothing. A small-town credit union manager might think twice, maybe even 3 times before handing over the keys or codes, and in a profession like mine, seconds meant safety. And the more you racked up during that crucial part of a job, the more danger of getting busted there was. And the one at the job that I'm talking about was no different. It was my job to get him to hand over the keys while TJ and Vincent watched the door and worked crowd control, and right away, just from the look in the manager's eyes, I knew that he wasn't going to play ball. I ended up bashing him over the head with my pistol a few times just to show that I was serious. I can't say that I'm altogether proud of that, but like I said, seconds mean safety. He took 1 hit, and then another, and he still didn't break. I was getting worried that he might not break at all until Vincent pointed at one of the 2 tellers working at the place and asked if she was the man's daughter. No, the manager was a lily-white Texan, while the teller looked like her parents came from Mexico or maybe further south. So when Vincent first suggested that she was the manager's daughter, I thought to myself, what are you smoking? But when I turned back to the manager, he had this look of pure terror in his eyes. Vincent smiled, jumped over the counter and then started tearing at the buttons on the girl's blouse, saying that he was going to do all this obscene stuff to her right in front of her dad. The manager just about lost his mind and promised to hand over the keys if Vincent promised not to touch her. And that was all it took, and we were out of there with a whole bunch of cash just a few minutes later. I later asked Vincent if he was serious, if he really would have done all those things that he talked about to make the manager hand over the keys. Now he just smiled that big wolfish smile of his and said, "Whatever it takes to get the job done, brother. Whatever it takes." Now I had no doubt in my mind that he meant what he said, and I don't think I've ever met anyone who was so obviously a dyed-in-the-wool psycho. But little did I know, I hadn't seen nothing yet. The next job we did with Vincent, we hit up a little savings bank just outside of San Antonio. One of the Mexican supervisors, who we needed to open up the safety deposit boxes, had some kind of meltdown and forgot all of her English. Maybe she did it on purpose to slow us down, or maybe it was genuine, who knows. But what I do know is that out of nowhere, Vincent steps up and starts straight up speaking fluent Spanish to her. Now he's not just talking Spanish either, he's talking to this chick like he's her damned uncle or something, trying to almost soothe and relax her. And you know something? It worked. She freezes up, stops screeching like a whistle, and then just looks at him as he gives his little speech. And then when he's done, she hands over the keys to the boxes, and once again, we're making our getaway in minutes flat. We all wanted to know what he said to that lady, but Vincent calmly explained that all he did was tell her what would happen if she didn't hand over those keys. That San Antonio bank job was the last we saw of Vincent for a little while. He said he had some business out of state, but that he was working on something in the meantime, and he'd let us know if he could use our help. Now, we said we appreciated him keeping us in mind, but to be honest, we were more than happy to go our separate ways. Vincent got the job done all right, but at the same time, he felt like a liability, like it was only going to be a matter of time before he did something terrible. Like what he said he was fixing to do to that guy's daughter right there in front of him. And maybe 9 months later, TJ gets a call from Vincent about that job that he said he was casing. I was in TJ's place when he got the call, and the second he said, "Oh, hey Vincent, how's your mom and them?" I got to rolling my eyes thinking, "Ah, crap, here we go again." Now there came a point in the conversation when TJ started sounding a little skeptical, saying stuff like, "I don't know, Vincent, sounds like a lot." But then Vincent said something to him, something I didn't hear, which made him look like Jesus Christ himself had just talked down that phone to him. Now his eyes went very wide and his jaw dropped a little, and he stayed very quiet for a long time before setting up a meeting. And I remember driving out to the diner with TJ and trying to figure out what was going on. He kept saying stuff like, "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," or "You're better off hearing it from the horse's mouth." He also said if he told me what Vincent had in mind, I'd probably duck and roll out of the car, and that's when I asked him to at least tell me what kind of job they'd talked about. TJ kept his eyes on the road but told me, "The last one before we retire." And after that, it was my turn to stay quiet and just stew in the mystery until we got to the diner. And when we got there, Vincent was leaning over this big plate of steak and eggs, eating it like he hadn't in weeks. And we asked him where he'd been, and he tells us, Mexico, and then explains how he's been eyeing up the score of a goddamn lifetime, just like TJ said. He'd been tracking these cash couriers south of the border for weeks, casing their routes, figuring out their schedules, and then putting together enough firepower to make the job doable. I asked him what kind of firepower we needed, if all we wanted to do was scare a couple of couriers, but he said to do that, we needed something that'd pierce armor. The golden rule of armed robbery is to not kill anyone, because then you're a murderer and the cops will hunt you like one. We don't use armored piercing anything because the best jobs are the kind where bullets don't get fired, and so when Vincent mentioned armor piercing, my ass was halfway out the door. But then he started talking about how to get the couriers to stop, we needed to at least demonstrate that we could pierce the armor on their trucks, and without that, they'd just roll through the ambush without stopping and they'd get away. Now, I guess I had it in my head that this was a regular job, and when I say regular, I mean your standard armored car job. So when Vincent said that the couriers were carrying some cash illegally across the border and were doing it for the Sinaloa cartel, I thought he'd lost his damned mind. Now, I feel like just about everyone in America knows who the cartel are these days, but the Sinaloa stand tall even among their fellow narcos. They're one of the oldest in Mexico, and at the time, they were by far the most powerful, too. They were led by the El Chapo guy for a while, and they don't mess around when it comes to protecting their operations. And so when Vincent suggested we rob them, I figured it'd be quicker to just shoot each other in the face right there and then, because if we robbed the cartel, that's how we were going to end up, dead as buzzard bait. But Vincent said he had a plan. At the time, the Sinaloa cartel was at war with the Juarez cartel. Couriers were getting robbed and their hitmen were dying by the dozen, but it was all just one big mess down there. But that meant, at least according to Vincent, that the Sinaloa wouldn't suspect a foursome of gringos to be responsible for robbing one of the couriers, at least not unless directed by their enemies in Juarez. And to him, it was foolproof, and if we did the job right, we could bring home enough laundered cash to retire on. We wouldn't have to worry about washing it. We wouldn't have to worry about anyone coming after us. All we'd have to do is figure out what kind of porch swing we wanted to sit our asses down on until we were old enough to die, and figure out which kind of beer we wanted to drink while we were doing it. I didn't realize how much I wanted out until I saw the crack in the door, and I guess it was the same for TJ and Jody too, because after thinking on it for all of 30 seconds, we decided to go for it. About a week later, we all met up with Vincent just before midnight for the long-ass drive down to the ambush site. Vincent's plan was relatively simple. At dawn, when the couriers approached our position in their 2 trucks, we'd pull up a heavy chain across the dirt road, kill their engines with our armor-piercing bullets, and then keep on shooting until any guards were dead and the drivers surrendered. When I asked him how he was so sure the drivers would just surrender, Vincent said that they were just that, drivers. They'd give themselves up once they realized that they were in trouble. Now I started getting doubts, because if those drivers lost all that cash, the cartel weren't going to just slap them on the back and say, "Better luck next time, hombre." They'd torture those guys first just to make sure that they weren't in on the scam. And then even if they weren't, they'd carve them up and hang them from a bridge just to make an example out of them. And the more I thought about it, the more I got this bad feeling in the pit of my stomach. But even when that feeling got so intense I wanted to puke, I'd push it back down again and tell myself, get this right, and you're home free. No more jobs, no more Vincent, no more worrying about anything ever again. And it was that which kept my mouth shut during that drive across the border. It was still dark as we set up, tying the chain to a tree before covering it with a thin layer of dirt. We dug little holes too on a low rise near the road, with one a little closer than the others so whoever was in it could pull the chain up and block the couriers. And after that, it was just a case of waiting and watching, and hoping those couriers didn't decide to rearrange their run at the last minute. Now we waited hours, watching the sun get higher and higher and feeling the air get warmer. Now Vincent said the trucks would roll by about an hour after dawn, but then 2 hours had gone by and there wasn't a truck to be seen, and I started to doubt that they were ever going to show up at all. Now by around 8 a.m. we were all sweating buckets, barely able to hear our own thoughts above all the noise that the cicadas were making. But then after maybe an hour of sweat and frustration, I remember seeing this glint of light on the horizon as 2 white trucks came into view. We started hooping and hollering a little, having sat in those dusty holes for so damn long, and Vincent told us to shut the hell up and be ready. Now as we watched the trucks getting closer and closer, TJ took hold of the chain, waiting for Vincent's signal to start yanking it up into the roadway. But when it came, and TJ forced those trucks to hard brake as it rose up, Vincent didn't aim for the engine blocks. He aimed right for the truck's tinted windows, and then unleashed hell. Someone in the second truck managed to get a few shots off, but Jody was ready with his AK, and it was pure chaos, but it was over in seconds. So quick that me and TJ didn't even get time to fire a shot. And then once the smoke had cleared and everything went quiet again except for the groans of the dying couriers, we made our move. As we ran towards the trucks, I remember TJ yelling about Vincent not having to shoot everyone. Vincent said what's done is done, and he should shut his mouth and get to work. TJ had only just unlocked the second truck's storage, and we were about to go rummaging around in the back when we suddenly heard the sound of a child crying. In a way that only a kid's cry can grab your attention like that, me and TJ ended up spinning around on the spot to see where the voices were coming from. I remember seeing Jody, wide-eyed, looking into the truck in front and then seeing Vincent open up one of the back doors and start speaking in Spanish. TJ had a daughter who stayed with his mom, so realizing that there had been kids in that lead truck just about sent him off the handle. He marched over to where Vincent was speaking Spanish to them and asked what he was doing. Vincent said he was telling them to stay in the trucks because someone would be coming by to get them before long. TJ didn't like that one bit on account of we all know what happens to kids or dogs when they're locked in hot cars. Him and Vincent went at it for about a minute, going back and forth about how those kids needed to be safe, and Vincent thought about it for a moment and then said we could just drop them off at a gas station or something once we got back on American soil. TJ didn't much like that idea either, but just like the whole surrendering drivers thing, I don't think Vincent was ever really planning on doing what he said. Because as me and Jody are hauling a big bag of cash back towards the place we'd hidden our own truck, we heard 2 gunshots and then the sound of TJ screaming. We dropped the bag of cash where we were and then ran back to see what was going on. I thought TJ might have gotten himself shot, possibly by a courier who wasn't dead as we thought he was. But when we got to the top of that rise and we saw why TJ was still screaming at Vincent and calling him all the curse words under the sun, he'd taken those 2 Mexican kids out of the truck, and he'd shot them both in the head. Vincent was probably a head and shoulder taller than TJ and almost twice as heavy too. But after what he did, shooting those 2 kids, TJ went at him like a monster. Vincent had to point his pistol just to get him to back off, but TJ lost his vertical and was yelling, "Why? Why? What'd they do to you, huh? What'd they do?" And Vincent started saying how the cartel could be on our asses if they talked, but this was after telling us about the war between the cartels and how they'd never know it was us. I still don't know for sure if that was really all nonsense or if he just switched his plan up at the last minute, but those kids, man, they didn't have to die. Only one person had to die down at that dirt road in Mexico, and it sure as hell wasn't those kids. And when Vincent finished giving his little speech on how this was just too much money at stake to take any chances, he turned his back on TJ to go grab one of the bags. TJ then pulled his pistol and shot Vincent about 4 or 5 times in the back, and he hit the dirt, gasping for air. Then walked over to him. TJ put him down with 1 shot to the head. Me and Jody didn't freak out, not like we'd done when we saw those kids lying there with the dirt soaking up their brains. What TJ did felt natural, almost. No one questioned him. We just grabbed all the cash we could carry, loaded it into the truck, and then took off back towards the border. We didn't celebrate the money. We couldn't. Even when we got someplace safe and realized our shares tallied up to just under $1 million each, we were too exhausted to do anything but sit quietly with a few beers and wonder how the hell it all went so wrong. Those kids weren't like 12 or 13. They were small. Too small to even talk, I really think, and they wouldn't have been able to tell us 4 gringos apart from the boys in ZZ Top. So why'd Vincent kill them? I remember asking that question out loud, but TJ'd had enough, and after stomping out a cigarette, he told me it didn't matter, because that son of a bitch was dead. And then off he went to pack his share of the money. Now once we were all packed up and we agreed to lay low for a while, Jody went to stay with his parents in Oklahoma while TJ took an extended vacation in New Orleans, and I went to stay with a girl that I'd been seeing for what amounted to a very low-key retirement party. I didn't tell her about Vincent or the kids, I just said I was done. Now she'd always wanted me to walk the line and get a real job, so the news was music to my ears, and she told me to stay as long as I needed, and then maybe 3 weeks later, TJ showed up again driving a new Dodge. Now it wasn't new, but we couldn't exactly go driving around in the same truck we used for the robbery, so it was a practical purchase. We went for a drive and caught up on things, and then TJ asked if I wanted to go get a burger or something later. I said sure, and we arranged for me to stop by his place around 7. Now it felt like we were starting fresh. We wouldn't have to look over our shoulder anymore. Work wasn't a topic of conversation we'd ever really have to touch on again, and we'd had more money than we could ever spend without pissing it away. It felt like we could just stop surviving and start living. And it was strange to find myself grinning like a mule eating cockleburrs over nothing but a burger with an old buddy. He dropped me back off at my place, and then after a few hours of chilling with my girl, I drove over to TJ's place and knocked on the door. and that Dodge was parked in the driveway, but when I knocked on his door, there was no answer. It was almost exactly 7, and he wasn't the kind of guy to flake on plans like that, and so assuming he was probably just running late and was in the shower or something, I walked around to the yard and tried the back door. TJ never locked his back door, ever. He always left it open in case we needed a place to crash, and he also wasn't keeping his share of the money there either, so right away I knew something was off. I'd crashed there a bunch before, so I knew that there was a way to jimmy open a window or the first floor, but after getting it open and climbing inside, I felt my stomach drop. And that old cliche about the smell of blood, how it sort of hangs in the air, very heavy in places where a lot of it's been spilled, it's as true as steel, especially on a warm Texas evening. And the smell of blood in TJ's house was so strong I felt the shiver run up my spine as I realized something really, really bad had gone down. And as I ran through the house, I started yelling out his name and asking where he was. I found him in the upstairs bathroom, curled up in the tub, and he wasn't just dead. It looked like someone had tried to take him apart. I didn't look for long. I couldn't. But from what little I saw, he had his fingers missing, part of his face was gone, and someone had carved off a big patch of skin away from his side, so much so that I could see a couple of his ribs peeking through. That's the snapshot I can't ever get out of my head, even though I must have looked for no more than a second. I didn't stay long. I just slipped out the way I came in, ran back to my truck, and drove straight over to Jody's place to tell him what I'd found. Someone had come looking for us. We knew that much, and we agreed the best thing to do in the meantime was hide out someplace. Jody said he could find us a place in Oklahoma, somewhere real quiet and out of the way, but we still needed to square some stuff away at home first. We needed to get the money, and we warned folks who needed warning. Then, we could meet at a motel just outside of town and drive to Oklahoma from there. Now, it sounded like a smart enough plan. Have a base of operations just outside of town for a few hours, and then be gone by the evening. But after driving all over town and making sure my girl got herself to her mom's, I arrived at the motel to feel my stomach drop a second time. There were cops outside the room Jody said he'd be in, and police tape across the open door. There were EMTs too, and I didn't see them walking around, but their ambulance was there, and it was all I needed to see to know that they'd gotten Jody too. I left town right away, tail between my legs, but with the money sitting in the trunk of my car. I planned on going back. I still got family down in Texas, but once I got to Oklahoma and found a motel, I saw a news report on TV. It was about Jody, but it wasn't just hearing about his murder that scared me so bad. It was the description a witness had given the police, which became the basis for their person of interest appeal. But it was that which made me feel like the devil himself was standing right there next to me, laughing his ass off at a joke I didn't get. Because when the newscaster read out the man's description, being that of a tall, stocky man with long hair and a wild-looking beard, it sounded almost exactly like Vincent. Someone matching that description had been seen in the motel's parking lot acting strange. Then around the same time as the murders, the same person was said to have hopped in a truck and driven away from the scene at some very serious speed. But then, Vincent wasn't the only guy in Texas to have a long-ass beard and a ponytail, so that all could have been a coincidence, right? But then what are the chances of the same person sporting an oversized hat and a bunch of bandages around his head? I had never been so freaked out in my whole life, and I'd never been in a situation where I actually considered pinching myself because I was half convinced that I'd wake up to discover that the whole thing was just some horrible nightmare. But it wasn't a dream. It was real, and I found myself faced with a very real possibility that Vincent had somehow survived TJ's attempt to kill him and had come to get his revenge. Looking back on it, I realized that it was much more likely to be the cartel and that somehow they figured out a way to track us down. But just the thought of some half-dead Vincent walking around looking like he'd crawled out of a grave, it sent shivers up my spine even all these years later. I live someplace else now, just about as far from Texas as it's possible to get without having to learn another language. So let's just say that whatever people speak here is sure as hell ain't Spanish. My name's Charlene, and I'm from Austin here in Texas, and I think I got a story that you might be interested in. It's one I've followed for the past 34 years now, and as of September of last year, it might finally have come to an end. But don't just take it from me. You can come to your own conclusions as I tell you, from my own perspective, about the yogurt shop murders. So in December of 1991, I was working at a store with a little strip mall in North Austin, and I had to open up the store on a Saturday morning. We were just down the strip from a branch of I Can't Believe It's Yogurt, a place that I used to stop by sometimes whenever the heat got a little too much. Now, mornings were usually nice and quiet, even on a Saturday, but on that morning, I noticed a whole bunch of police standing outside the yogurt shop. I knew not to be nosy, but I couldn't help but ask if everything was all right, as smoky black stains suggested some kind of fire. One officer told me it was fine and that I should just go about my business. Now, he said it in a friendly voice, but a smile didn't quite reach his eyes. The police were still standing outside the yogurt shop when I clocked out and began making my way home. Only that time, there were men in shirts and ties standing with them, talking and taking notes. I caught a ride home with a friend, got to work on making dinner, and then later on while watching the evening news, I got a new report on what had happened at the yogurt shop, and I don't think that I'd ever been so horrified in my entire life. The newsreader described how, just the previous night, a fire had been reported at the yogurt shop. That didn't really come as a surprise, as I'd already seen the scorch marks and the soot. But the newsreader went on to say that after putting the fire out, firefighters were horrified to discover the naked, lifeless bodies of 4 young women. On the shop floor, a 15-year-old girl named Sarah Harbison lay dead on the tiles. Her body was joined by those of 17-year-old Eliza Thomas and Sarah's 17-year-old sister, Jennifer Harbison. All 3 had been shot in the head after being stripped and gagged with their own underwear. And then, thanks to the fire that had no doubt been started by their killer, each of the girls had extensive burns all over their bodies. In the back of the store, police found the body of a 13-year-old girl named Amy Ayers. Her burns weren't as bad as the other girls, but she'd been shot, execution style, same as the other girls. And the whole of Austin was shocked to its core by what had happened, and there were all kinds of tributes and vigils and whatnot so people could mourn the girls' passing and console their families. But once all that sadness was gone, once all the tears had been cried, it was replaced by this sense of anger and fury toward whoever had taken the girls' lives. It was so bad that a couple of days later, when some teenager was found carrying the same kind of gun as was used in the murders, everyone was convinced the cops had found the guilty party. I think 100 years prior, and they'd have broke into the county jail and lynched that poor kid. And I say poor kid because he was innocent of the murders and tried lying his way out of trouble because he was scared to catch a gun charge. But then once the police rolled him out as a suspect, there was this shared sense of frustration, like it was back to the drawing board, as it were. And we all hoped a new suspect would be found, and soon, but we had to wait years for any developments to this investigation, and when they arrived, it made no sense at all. When a new detective took over the case, he decided that the most likely suspects were actually the poor teenager I mentioned, along with 3 of his friends. You see, when they were first picked up, the cops were so convinced of their innocence that no record was made of what was said during their interviews, but that meant that this new lead detective wanted to interview them all over again. And the entirety of Austin was confused as hell because if these kids, who were by then in their 20s, had already been cleared, then why the heck were they being interviewed all over again? Now, we thought that it was some big waste of time and that the real killer was still out there, so imagine our shock when 2 of the boys, Rob Springsteen and Mike Scott, confessed to the murders during the second round of interviews. They went to trial and were convicted of capital murder, and both ended up receiving life in prison. We thought that was the end to the story, that those poor girls' killers had been found and that they were where they belonged. But then in 2008, we got another shocker when the Court of Appeals overturned both boys' convictions on account of improper procedure. It was a shocker, all right, but we still felt trapped in that same terrible spiral, if that makes sense, because the state announced that they were seeking a retrial. I felt like tearing my damned hair out when I heard the news, but then came the DNA announcement, because after all the analysis of all the samples, there was no evidence whatsoever that any of the 4 boys had anything to do with the yogurt shop murders. And after that, it was that same back to square one feeling, but it was much less hopeful. Almost 20 years had come and gone. The trails had no doubt gone cold, and many of my friends and neighbors were resigned to the fact that the killer would never be caught. And maybe about a year later, one of the original suspects ended up getting shot to death by police after a traffic stop went horribly wrong. Maurice Pierce, who didn't go to trial and wasn't sent to prison, ended up stabbing a police officer in the neck during a traffic stop. Another shocker, only a really nasty one that time. The officer almost died, and it got us all wondering if there had been some kind of mistake with the DNA testing. I mean, the guy tried to murder a cop by stabbing him in the neck, so even if he wasn't proven guilty, he sure as hell didn't seem innocent, you know? Now, we had to wait another 11 years for another development, by which time we'd next to given up on the yogurt shop killer ever being caught. And it made me sick to think that he was out there, walking free after doing such a terrible, evil thing. But then, in December of 2021, we got one heck of an early Christmas present when the yogurt shop case was once again reopened. Advanced DNA techniques were going to be used, meaning that even though so much time had passed, we were closer than ever to finding out who did it, because as I might have said, the cops had a DNA sample from someone they believed was the killer, and it was simply a case of finding a match. Now, even more resources were dedicated to the case in 2022 and 2023, which had us all praying that the murders would be solved once and for all. And then finally, in September of last year, so 2025, Austin police announced that they'd solved the case. After running DNA samples alongside the one from the yogurt shop, they realized that it was a near-perfect match for a man named Robert Brashers. Brashers was a serial killer who had been previously linked to the yogurt shop murders by DNA, and as early as 2018 if memory serves. But without the proper technology, police couldn't put it beyond reasonable doubt until just months ago. It was nice to finally know who was responsible, but it hurt knowing justice would never be truly served, as Brashers took his own life during a shootout with police in 1999. After getting the DNA results, police managed to get a hold of the gun that he used during that shootout. They test-fired it and then compared the bullet casing to one found at the yogurt shop crime scene, and it was an exact match. The news marked the end of a long, painful, and frightening story in the history of this town, one we could finally put to bed. But for some of us, who've been forever affected by what happened to those poor teenage girls, it's not over. And I recently read that under Texas law, if someone is imprisoned and later the conviction not only gets overturned, but the person is also declared innocent, they get up to $80,000 for each year they were wrongfully imprisoned. The article I read had a quote from lawyers of Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott. They said that they were hopeful that they My name's Drew, and back in the early 90s, I was a student up at Evergreen State College in Washington. It's a beautiful campus, but it was also kind of out of the way. So unless you had a car, you had to either attach yourself to someone who did, or you had to find something to do on campus in between cramming or part-time jobs or whatever you're up to. Now Josh, one of the guys I shared a class with, worked at the campus TV station. And then one day, since they were short a few people, he asked if I wanted to come over and help out for an afternoon. Now, I didn't have anything better to do, and it sounded more exciting than sitting around the quad all afternoon doing nothing, and so off we went. Now, it was hard to believe that they were making actual TV shows there, but that's exactly what I watched them do, and with an impressive level of professionalism, too. The week after, I asked my buddy if he needed any extra help again. And then before long, I was running the audio board for other people's shows or editing tape on those big linear editing decks that took forever for stuff to queue up. Now it was fun as hell, and I got to meet a ton of weird, cool people. Like this one guy doing a dorm room cooking show with nothing but a hot plate. Or this other guy who used to rant about the Seahawks until he was red in the face and the veins were bulging in his neck. We'd record the shows, transfer them to VHS, then after sending them off to the cable channel, we'd throw little watch parties whenever they aired. Now, it was an awesome feeling seeing it go out over the airwaves, and I immediately started thinking how cool it'd be to have something I'd made broadcast as far as Tacoma. Now, I had to wait until someone quit their slot, of course, as there weren't any free ones available, But when our Seahawks guy finally ran out of trash to talk about his team, I had an opportunity to take a slot for myself. The only question was, with what? Now, I brainstorm all kinds of ideas and briefly entertained the idea of doing comedy skits. But then, I had a brainwave. Everyone has at least some local pride, right? And the one thing everyone enjoys is a damn good mystery story. So if I planned out a show that involved investigating local mysteries and led with a story that everyone would identify with, I might actually get some eyeballs on my work. And the one local legend that got not just national, but international attention was good old Bigfoot. Now, Bigfoot was actually a personal interest of mine, just not in the way you think. I was a believer once, and after moving to the Pacific Northwest, I read On the Track of the Sasquatch and The Apes Among Us by John Green, as well as The Bigfoot Casebook by Janet and Colin Board. The Apes Among Us is a particularly fascinating read, and Green is very passionate about the subject. There's just one problem. I don't believe a word of it anymore. Logically speaking, we'd have probably found Bigfoot's skeleton by now, and I'm not just talking about Peter Kane dog trainer, as while there are a plethora of other reasons why the Bigfoot myth is just that, a myth, the biggest debunker is the issue of the remains. But what I'd never personally seen is anyone putting those reasons to a true believer, one who'd actually done the research on it themselves, and if done respectfully and amicably, I figured I might have cracked the formula to some pretty great television. Now, I managed to find a guy who ran a guided Bigfoot tour that included a night of camping in areas where there had been plenty of sightings, apparently. Now, I'm guessing the camping alone gave the guests a spooky enough atmosphere when all they were really doing was hanging out and having fun together with some like-minded people. Now, I get it, man, I do. It's fun to have friends and tell spooky stories, but I wanted to know if what the guide was saying stood up to any scrutiny. And not in a mean, you're a liar, mister kind of way, more like as a way of exploring the veracity of the subject in a way that didn't sensationalize it, and asking all the questions folks at home wanted to ask on their behalf. Now, I didn't think that'd be an attractive prospect, but luckily, Brandon, the tour guide, actually agreed to it. Now, Brandon was a real character. He was warm, friendly, and immediately saw my offer as an opportunity to promote his business. He said he didn't mind if I had questions because he'd been answering them for the better part of 20 years. And as long as I didn't try making him look stupid in front of the other folks on the tour, I was welcome to ask anything I wanted. Now, my buddy Josh and I went out to meet him one weekend to shoot some opening footage that had run before that of the actual tour. Brandon looked like I imagined him. Flannel shirt, jeans, big mustache, and beer gut. Now, he was also so excited to be on a TV show, even if it was just public access, that he made for a fantastic interviewee. By the time we were done with the segment, I was actually psyched to go on the tour with him, if only for the fact it'd be fun to hang out with him overnight in the woods. And even if I didn't get to debunk the whole Bigfoot thing, and in the space of a half-hour cable access show, it'd still make for great viewing. And when the Saturday of the tour rolled around, me and Josh drove out to where Brandon was based. We borrowed a car and one of the station's crappy camcorders, and then once all of Brandon's tourists were assembled, we hit the trails, and it wasn't long before my questions began. When Brandon talked about eyewitness sightings, I brought up how unreliable they were. Then when he brought up tracks and footprints, I brought up how the famous Patterson-Gimlin tracks were eventually proven to be a hoax. I kept it friendly. There was no gotcha moments, and the other guests actually enjoyed us talking about Native American references to megafauna. And we agreed, and quite excitedly too, that modern technology brought us all closer to a definitive truth, but at least one of the other guests did not appreciate our approach. There was this older guy who looked to be in his late 40s, jean shorts, hoodie, ball cap, shades. Now, he'd been quiet for almost all of the hike, but his facial expressions and body language were getting louder and louder. Then when me and Brandon started discussing Bigfoot population numbers, he boiled over completely. Brandon made the point that animals which adapt to colder climates generally exist in low numbers, like in the case of polar bears or certain kinds of whales. It was a pretty solid retort to my point that an ape the size of Bigfoot would need a large population to avoid inbreeding. But when I circled back around to the point about calorie consumption, as Bigfoots would have to eat crazy amounts of food and would therefore leave a crazy amount of poop, I imagine, the guy with the ball cap and shades turned around and got right up in my face. The man that I'll only refer to as Angry Dave was all red and puffed up, asking what my problem was, and saying that a Bigfoot tour wasn't some place for some close-minded college kid. I tried telling him I wasn't close-minded, that I'd read a bunch of literature on the topic and I wanted nothing but the truth. But Dave replied that I knew nothing about the woods or real life and accused me of trying to ruin the tour for everyone else just so I could feel like a smarty party. Now I get why he was mad, and Josh had already suggested how joining an actual tour might lead to something like that. Brandon had insisted that we do just that, probably because the presence of a TV camera made him look all newsworthy or whatever. And I guess he felt his share of the blame too, because he stepped in fast to say, "It's okay, I invited the guy," offering a more private tour at Angry Dave's convenience. But Dave didn't want to hear it. He stepped closer, got louder, and even looked like he was about to swing for me at one point. Between myself, Josh, and Brandon, we managed to calm him down enough to continue the tour, with Dave doing nothing but glaring at me every time I spoke. Now, I kept the questions to an absolute minimum following the confrontation, as in addition to the nighttime stuff we were about to shoot, Josh and I had more than enough footage to put together a 30-minute segment. Now, once we had all of our tents set up, Brandon had got a little campfire going and conversations moved away from Bigfoot, and the tension started to lift. Even Angry Dave started to lighten up a little, even if he did roll his eyes or shake his head at pretty much anything near Josh came on with. Now, after we all retired to our tents, Josh and I shot a little more footage, basically saying that we'd started shooting again if we heard any creepy noises. Now, we didn't expect to hear any. In fact, I was convinced that if we did hear any noises, it'd be Brandon out there faking them to play a friendly prank on the skeptics. But as it turned out, on that point, I was dead wrong. I was pretty tired from all the walking, and me and Josh had to get up super early that morning to check our gear. So once we shot our tent footage and lay down in our bedrolls, I don't think either of us lasted even a minute before we were dead to the world. I guess we were out around 3 hours or so, because the next thing I know, Josh is shaking me awake at like 1 a.m. while whispering, Dude, listen." We stayed quiet for a second, and then I suddenly heard this loud, sharp thwacking sound in the distance, like someone was hitting the trunk of a tree with a large branch. It might sound strange, but it was such a clearly identifiable sound, but it was also one with some very sinister connotations. Now, for those of you that don't know, Bigfoot is supposed to hit trees with sticks as a form of communication. Some say it's how Bigfoots talk to each other, and it is Bigfoots, not big feet, but others say that they're a warning to humans, and the people who've ignored these warnings have then mysteriously gone missing. Now, I didn't think it was Bigfoot at all. I thought it was Brandon. But when we got out of the tent with the camera, I saw Brandon and another tourist standing there all wide-eyed and looking spooked. I guess it was sort of a nervous reaction on my part, but I whispered a joke to Brandon about how I figured the noise would be him trying to play a prank on us. I thought he might see the funny side, but he didn't. He just shook his head like he well and truly believed it was Bigfoot out there, and then shushed us so we could keep on listening to those spaced-out thwacking sounds. Now, Brandon had already explained what we were hearing during the tour, so as all the other tourists got out their tents to join us, each of them had that same look of fear and wonder on their faces. I started whispering to the camera to explain the sounds, and then out of nowhere, we all heard this blood-curdling scream from off in the distance, about the same distance the dull thwacks were coming from. Now everyone's like, "Oh my God," and even Brandon looked terrified. And I won't lie, Josh and I got pretty spooked too, and I remember thinking it was some type of prank, and then it was a damn good one. But then, one of the other tourists realized that Angry Dave's tent was empty, and I watched Brandon's head just spin around, terrified. He asked if anyone had seen or heard him, and one of the others said that they'd woken up to hear him walking off somewhere like he went to pee, but evidently he hadn't returned. Someone else then asked if Dave might have gone looking for the source of the sound, and since that scream sounded like it came from a man of Dave's age and size, Brandon went into full-on crisis mode thinking that this guy was hurt. Now he grabbed his flashlight and then went tearing off into the woods yelling Dave's name. The rest of us followed like we were programmed to, with the tourist close behind and Josh and I at the rear with the camera. We ran for about a minute or two, all yelling out Dave's name, and when Brandon stopped, we stopped too. He asked us to fan out and look around, as Dave might be so hurt that he actually couldn't respond. Now, one of the other tourists then asked if he thought that Bigfoot had outright killed Dave and might have dragged him off someplace after attacking him, but Brandon said he didn't know, and it was like that answer made things worse for everyone. They wanted him to have answers, so when he didn't, it frightened everyone all the more. Now, I didn't think we were about to encounter a Bigfoot. I thought Dave had walked off and taken some tumble in the dark, or worse, maybe gotten himself attacked by an animal or something. Now, just because he hadn't been attacked by some mythical creature didn't mean that he wasn't in danger, and the same applied to us, too. Walking through those dark woods was seriously scary, and it's crazy how much fear can make you doubt yourself. And by that, I mean I was scared that I actually started wondering if I was about to be proved wrong about Bigfoot, and in spectacularly horrifying fashion. I didn't fully start to believe or anything. I just struggled to compute how nightmarishly ironic it'd be if I was torn apart by something I didn't even believe existed. Brandon had his gun with him, but no one else was armed, so I had to go walking through the dark forest with nothing but a big stick in my hand and a camera in Josh's. The whole time I'm yelling Dave's name, asking him to call out to us to let us know where he is. But I'm also spinning on the spot to face every little noise, like I was expecting Bigfoot to come rushing out of the darkness into our flashlight beams before picking us up and bashing us against the trees. I had my head on a swivel, and Josh had to do everything in his power to keep a steady shot, and he still couldn't keep his hands from shaking. But when it came too quickly for either of us to do anything about it, and I barely even saw that giant stick before it smashed into my head. I went down like a ton of bricks, while Josh was so startled by the sudden presence that he fell back on his butt and dropped the camera. But even if he hadn't, and he kept on filming as that stick smashed into my ribs, and then hips, and then legs, he wouldn't have recorded me getting attacked by a Bigfoot, because the only person attacking me was Angry Dave. Mine and Josh's yelling attracted the attention of the others, and to his absolute credit, it was Brandon who showed up seconds later with his gun drawn, telling Dave to put the stick down or he'd shoot. Now, I guess there's no love lost between me and Dave at this point, but while I appreciate that some of you might think I'm exaggerating to make him look bad, I'm definitely not. And so when I say he looked so out of his mind with rage that it appeared that he might charge at Brandon at any second, I'm not just saying that. And for a moment or two, I was legitimately scared that I was about to watch him get his head blown off. He looked at Brandon, then down at me like he wanted to just keep on hitting me. But right as he raised the stick up again, Brandon yelled out that he'd shoot if he hit me again. And that sort of brought Dave back to reality, I guess. He stepped back, dropping the stick while still red as a beet. Then I guess when he realized what he'd done and how we might have had it all on camera, we didn't, Dave turned and went running back to the camp to grab his stuff. He left just as hastily as Brandon and the other tourists yelled at him, saying the cops would be informed. I remember feeling a little smug, knowing that he'd given me all the ammo I needed to get his ass thrown in jail. But he hit me so hard that I had blood running down from my hairline, and it hurt so bad that I knew I needed to get to a hospital right away. Dave had obviously faked all the stick sounds and the scream, and according to the cops, his original intention was only to scare me. But when he saw me and Josh with our camera, especially me being lit up like a freaking Christmas tree, the red mist descended, and he attacked me with the same stick that he'd been using to hit that tree. He ended up spending about 6 months inside, which was better than nothing, I guess, whereas I got myself a nice little hairline scar as a souvenir. It sucked having to get stitches and stuff, and for a while, the doctors were worried that I'd have a pretty bad concussion. But to me, the worst thing was that Brandon revoked his permission for us to air the footage. He'd already signed a waiver, but Josh and I didn't much feel like going to war with him over it, so to speak, and he'd been so nice and welcoming it wasn't his fault that he accidentally brought along some fanatical psycho. Airing the footage would have the opposite effect on his business, so when he coupled his revocation with a polite request, I couldn't find it in myself to just ignore it. I guess that's about the end of the story, though. But don't worry, I'm not going to try and end on some poignant line about lessons learned, because I think the lessons here are obvious to all who wish to learn them. So, my mom was originally from Russia, and she lived up there during the Soviet years, but she never really talked about it while I was growing up. I learned this was because you could divide Soviet immigrants into one of two categories: those who talked about their old lives back in the USSR, and those who didn't. And those who talked tended to complain about it, saying things like, "We had equality for all, equally empty shelves and equally long lines," or my personal favorite, "The future was bright, the present was gray, and the past was whatever the party said it was." But those who didn't talk about it, you learn not to pry. Some people escaped communism with nothing but nightmares and the clothes on their back. And thankfully, while nothing too terrible ever happened to Mom, she had a few stories of her own. Now, back when she was still a student, Mom volunteered to work at a pioneer camp for the summer, which was exactly the same as an American summer camp in almost every way. She was a guardian there, which is basically what they called their counselors, and in addition to all the games, activities, and fresh air, guardians served up generous doses of Soviet propaganda. Mom said the camps were like paradise on the surface, but in this one place, beneath the smiles and the slogans, there was a kind of tension in the air. From what she could gather, the head guardian had been selected by this one committee. Almost everything in Russia at that time was run by committee, so the decision of the guardian appointing committee had to be ratified by this other committee. Now, once their approval had been secured, the head guardian was approved. But then the head of the other committee suddenly changed his mind because his spoiled, bratty-ass son wanted to be head guardian. Now, the guy goes about trying to reverse the decision, first by bureaucracy, but when that failed, he turned to threats. No one threatened the head guardian, not directly anyway, but there was talk of having him removed, even closing the camp down completely. Mom said this went on for like 2 weeks, getting a slow drip of information, partly fact and partly rumor. And then one day, the head guardian announced the whole thing was over. A decision had come down from on high, guaranteeing his place at the camp for the next couple of years, and since the guy was a pretty beloved figure, everyone was happy about it. Every person except one. Mom said a few nights later, after all the kids had been put to bed, she was doing her rounds on the second floor of a dorm. She remembered checking in on this one group when suddenly this deep feeling of unease came over her. Russia's a place of extremes. Super cold in the winter, but then depending where you're at, it can get super hot during the summer. Now that night was no different, so the air in all the dorms was very warm. But in that one, the air felt just like a little too warm in places. And then suddenly, she started to smell the smoke. She could tell right away it wasn't just campfire smoke. A smell she was very familiar with by then because the smoke that night had an artificial, chemical sort of scent to it. Then, when she ran to the window and saw flames licking up the walls from the ground floor, she realized fire was spreading fast. So Mom hit the dorm's alarm and in doing so, unleashed total chaos. The alarm scared the kids half to death, so they were almost blind with panic as they came tearing out of their rooms. Things would have been way worse if Mom and some other guardians weren't bunked in the same building and they were able to restore a little order once they came out of their rooms. But then when a guardian discovered the stairwells were full of smoke, they realized that to escape, They had no choice but to basically throw the kids from the second-floor windows, and they had to do it fast. Smoke was building up, people were coughing, and as the kids were starting to panic. Mom said that at first some of the older ones tried to help the little ones, but it wasn't long until panic took over and the guardians lost control. And then not only did she watch kids literally climbing over each other, but kids as young as 6 or 7 were pushing open the windows and then just leaping out into the dark before hitting the ground with these sickening thuds. Now, it was only the second floor, so the kids who jumped didn't get hurt too bad. But they were landing on concrete, so Mom said it was still pretty horrifying to hear their thuds as they landed awkwardly, followed by their screams of pain as they broke bones or sprained ankles. And outside on the ground, camp guardians were running around with buckets of water doing anything they could to at least slow the spread, but Mom said those buckets were all but useless against those flames. More adults poured out into the scene from the staff quarters while Mom kept on herding the kids towards the windows. One little disabled girl she was carrying went limp in her arms from the smoke, and Mom had to fight through the crowd to get her to a window. She said things were starting to look really bad, but right when the kids needed to, the bus showed up. The camp's groundskeeper, this big burly guy whose name was Grigor, ended up driving the camp's bus right up to the burning dorm, so it was running lengthways alongside it. It meant the kids had something to break their fall while jumping from the corridor windows, of which there were many. So as soon as the guardians realized what was happening, they told the kids to jump, and they came pouring out to land on top of the bus. Guardians were on the ground too, helping them down when they landed. Some of the kids hit the bus pretty hard and got hurt that way too, but even the ones who bounced or fell had something there to catch them. Mom said that Grigor's quick thinking saved dozens of lives, her own included. And then once the last few kids had jumped on top of the bus, Mom and another guardian jumped too, and just in the nick of time, because Mom said that once she had her feet on solid ground, she turned to see the bus was starting to catch fire itself. By dawn, the dorm building was a soaking wet ruin. It took the fire department a while to make it out there, so by the time they arrived, the dorm was pretty much done for. Their trucks were still there by sunup, as were the medics treating injured kids, and the worst of which were laid out on blankets not far from the ruins of their dorm. Parents started showing up worried not long after because you could see the smoke for miles around. But here's where things started getting even darker, because a lot of those parents showed up to a police perimeter with cops telling them to go home and wait for news there. Mom said they wanted to control the flow of information coming in and out, so they showed up fast to stop panic from spreading. Mom helped with the cleanup and then helped set up makeshift hospital tents. But as she worked, she found herself fixated on this one little detail she'd overlooked that previous night. When she ran to the windows and saw the fire for the first time, she remembered seeing someone running for the tree line off in the distance, but then seeing the flames sent her into action, so the image of that figure running off didn't return until later. But even then, it was pretty obvious the fire was no accident. The firefighters found signs of gas or some flammable liquid, which explained the chemical smell Mom had caught early on, and then once it became clear it was arson, the police took over completely. Mom said it was obvious who did it and that the only person with any ill will against the camp was the son of that committee head, who was bitter about not getting his way. And so when the police announced that they'd found the arsonist and that it had been some hermit living a few miles away in the woods, everyone was very surprised. No one even knew that the guy had been living out there, not in all the time the camp had been running, so he'd obviously kept to himself. And then when they said they caught him with a ton of stolen gas cans, the kind used at the camp depot, things made even less sense. We hadn't noticed any fuel going missing, and why would a hermit steal gas if he didn't have anything that ran on it? But as was custom back then, when authorities spoke, people didn't talk back. The hermit was just a raggedy old loner with no one to speak up for him, and so to authorities, it was an open and shut case. They hauled him in, gave him a closed-door trial, and then announced he was going to be executed for 50 counts of attempted murder, with the aggravating factors being that his target was a dorm full of little kids. Not even a month went by. That poor hermit was executed, And then all these big wigs went around patting themselves on the back, telling everyone the children were safe again. But Mom said that's just what they wanted them to think. The Guardian started hearing rumors about the hermit. Stuff like how he was half blind, could barely walk straight most days. How does a guy like that sneak into a guarded camp, set the dorm on fire, and then run off before anyone could apprehend him? He doesn't, because whoever really set the dorm on fire was running at full speed when my mom saw them, meaning that they were young, fit, and healthy, and not some old hermit. And the cover-up stank, and Mom said the mood got so bad that party officials came around to the camp to personally remind the Guardians that spreading false rumors meant losing their jobs or worse. Mom kept her mouth shut and her head down, but said that inside she was boiling. After the camp closed for the season, Mom went back to her regular life, but the anger and the nightmares both stuck around. The kids mostly recovered. A few had scars from burns or falls, but all were traumatized by what they went through. Mom carried her own scars too, mental ones, in the form of the knowledge that sometimes justice gets buried under politics. Before she moved to America and once the Soviet Union started collapsing, Mom thought about digging into it more, maybe finding old records or talking to other survivors. She'd always believed it was the committee's head kid who lit the fire and that the hermit was just a convenient scapegoat. Some poor soul who made the perfect patsy, whose secret trial ensured nobody could ask any serious questions in open court. Hearing her tell it like that hit me hard. This wasn't just some story in a book that we read in history class. It was my mom's life, something she lived through and that shaped her into the tough, no-nonsense woman she was. She always made sure that I knew the value of speaking up, even when it might seem scary, because, as she so correctly said, staying quiet lets the bad people get away with things. Many years ago, I got home from work to find my girlfriend, now wife, having dinner in front of the TV. We talked about our days as I made myself some coffee, and then suddenly, the news guy said something about a murder that had taken place close by. A local man had been found dead in his home, having been stabbed just shy of 100 times. The sheer number of wounds had us thinking, Jesus Christ, that poor man. And it was very shocking to have something like that happen in the quiet, relatively crime-free area we lived in. But then they flashed the victim's picture on screen, and as I looked at him and heard his name, I felt the color and blood drain from my face. When my girlfriend asked if I knew the guy, I nodded. I said his name was Ryan. Now, it's not his real name, and he was a counselor at a summer camp that I went to as a child. Now, she knew that I'd been to a camp as a kid, but I'd never told her the story of Ryan and how much he'd affected my life one summer back when I was a child. And then over the next hour or so, I laid it all out for her. And this, in so many words, is what I said. When I was 11 years old, Mom and Dad decided that I was going to summer camp again that year. We moved across the country not long before, so while I wasn't psyched about going to a new place, I was way past the tantrums and I don't want to go phase of my life. And they showed me some pamphlets for this place called Camp Choctaw. Now, it's not its real name, but I thought it sounded cool. And the kids looked like they were having some huge amounts of fun, and the theme was all things Native American, with plenty of archery, making teepees, and weaving dream catchers. During the final week, the camp held a big powwow where all the kids got to make their own headdresses, and the counselors cooked on a barbecue instead of in the cafeteria. I thought it looked awesome, and while making new friends was always nerve-wracking, I was stoked to be heading to Camp Choctaw for a month come summertime. The camp was in a giant clearing out in the middle of the woods with these cool log-style cabins with big porches scattered around. A big open pavilion thing sat in the middle with picnic tables, and further back I could see the cafeteria and what looked like some sort of activities lodge. Now there were also a couple of brightly colored teepees set up near the pavilion, but we were told that they were just a display piece and that no one got to sleep in them. Now that didn't matter to me though. But even without getting to sleep in an actual teepee like a Native American, the place looked awesome. There were already tons of kids running around by the time me and my dad showed up. I could see the counselors too, mostly college-aged guys, but a couple of older men also. And apart from the cook, who seemed kind of grouchy, they all seemed like really fun dudes. All the younger guys were wearing bandanas or beads and stuff like that, and I remember this blonde dude came over to my dad's car with this big smile like, "Hey buddy, you ready for the best week ever?" Then as we're getting out of the car, he asked, "What's your name?" "My name's Ryan." That was my first meeting with him, and never in a million years did I imagine things would end the way they did. But life is strange sometimes like that, I guess. Now, after I said goodbye to my dad, I joined the other kids, and then eventually I heard my name being called by one of the counselors. I joined a big group of boys and being herded over towards the main lodge where the head counselor, a taller, older man, told us that we were all in cabin 4, and that our group name was the Wolves. Now, we followed him down this little path through the trees where we were met by an awesome log cabin with a big wooden wolf carved over the door. Now, it smelled like bug spray and cleaning fluid. And then as we all piled in and started picking bunks, I remember this skinny kid with messy brown hair and a dinosaur shirt coming up to me and asking if he can take the one above mine. Now, I told him, "Sure, dude," trying to sound nonchalant even though I was pretty nervous. And then over the next half hour or so, we got to know each other a little. Now, by the time the counselor came in to give us a little orientation speech, Tommy and I were already sitting on the floor together, sharing snacks while laughing about how this one kid looked like a burrito when all zipped up in his sleeping bag. Now, that first night, we all stayed up way too late, planning out all the cool stuff we were going to do in these whispers. And then for the next 3 weeks or so, Tommy and I became best friends. Now, whether it was making clay pots, being partners in 3-legged races, or finding sneaky ways to help ourselves to some extra s'mores, Tommy and I did it together. It felt like it was going to be the best summer of my whole life, and that me and Tommy were going to be best buddies till the day we died. And then one day, about midway through the second week, I woke up in the middle of the night to find Tommy gone from his bunk. I needed to use the bathroom, really bad too, so my first thought after my eyes opened was bathroom. But as I got up, that's when I noticed Tommy's bunk was empty. I figured he'd also gone to take a leak, so I walked out of the cabin thinking that I'd bump into him or see him on the way or whatever. But on the walk to the bathroom, I didn't see Tommy, and neither was he in the bathroom when I walked inside there. Now I'm thinking, that's weird. And then after taking a whiz and washing up, I walked out into the night again to sort of whisper Tommy's name like, "Tommy! Tommy!" At first, there was nothing but silence, and so I kept going towards the pavilion near where the teepees were and kept on calling out for Tommy. Now, it felt creepy as hell being out there all alone after dark, then right as I'm thinking I should maybe just go back to my dorm, I hear this low, eerie whine, almost like an animal, but different. It sent literal chills through me, and while I somehow managed to keep quiet, I sprinted back to my cabin and jumped in my bunk, waking everyone up in my cabin in the process and severely pissing them off. They asked me what was wrong, but when I said, "There's something out there," they listened for just a second before being like, "No, there isn't, dumbass. Go back to sleep." Now, it might sound weird, but being shamed like that actually did calm me down. If my cabin mates weren't freaked out, then it was most likely just my imagination getting the better of me. I also realized I was scared Tommy was headed home early for some reason, like he'd gone off to the nurse with some illness in the middle of the night and was on his way to the hospital or something with me none the wiser. But then in the morning, and much to my relief, there was Tommy, lying in his bunk like the previous night's strangeness was nothing but a weird dream. I was majorly relieved to see him, but since the other kids had also noticed he was missing, it wasn't just me who wanted to know where he'd gone. But when asked, Tommy told us that he'd gone over to the counselor's bathroom for a dump, instead of using the gross one that we all shared. I didn't just buy it. It was like, that boy's a genius, because that shared outhouse thing was nasty as hell. But after we were all done being like, "The hell didn't we think of that?" I told Tommy about the weird noise that I heard outside. I said it sounded like an animal, but that it also had this kind of creepy familiarity to it. And Tommy just looked at me blankly for a second and then said that he hadn't heard anything during the walk to the counselor's place, or on the way back again. But then, and I know this might sound weird, I couldn't tell if he was serious or not. Tommy had pulled a few pranks on me over the previous few weeks, enough that I'd got an idea when he was lying or not, and when he told me that he didn't hear anything, he couldn't hold eye contact. And I asked him once if he was sure, and then when he insisted, I changed the subject and jokingly suggested that there was a vampire or werewolf running around camp after dark. Tommy played along and laughed, but something just felt off. I figured maybe he was tired and hoped that he wasn't coming down with something that would result in him going home early. We kind of dawdled behind as we're talking, with all the other kids filing past us on their way to breakfast. And then just after I cracked the joke about the vampires or werewolves, a counselor I called Todd came over to usher us along. Now, Todd was friendly enough, but you know when you just sort of get a bad feeling about someone when you're a kid? Yeah, that. He just seemed kind of fake, like he was always right on the cusp of his patience wearing thin, at which point he dropped the cool counselor act and revert to his natural douchebag-like state. Now, he came over saying, "Hey guys, everything all right?" But before I could even answer, Tommy was making a beeline for the cafeteria. Now, I remember thinking, dude, wait up, in my head, but while I didn't strictly like Counselor Todd, I couldn't exactly just go walking off without answering him. So I was kind of glued to the spot thinking, damn it, now I gotta talk to him. I basically lied and told him everything was fine, and then he told me to catch up with the others. But then as I'm walking off, Todd asked if I needed someone to take me to the bathroom. I was 11, dude, not like 4. No one had asked me if I wanted them to take me to the bathroom since I was back in diapers. But again, this dude's an authority figure, so I'm not rude to him. I'm just thinking, no thanks, Todd, I'm good. I was actually kind of mad when I caught up with Tommy. I mean, not like mad, but I was still saying, dude, why the hell did you just leave me with that weirdo? He told me he was hungry and just wanted to get to the cafeteria, but I could tell that wasn't it. I got so frustrated that I asked him pretty loudly what the hell had gotten into him, only to be immediately warned by one of the counselors to keep my cool. I ended up apologizing to Tommy after breakfast, saying I didn't mean to yell at him, but that's when he offered his own apology and told me how I was kind of right. Something was bothering him, so much it was making him feel sick, so sick that he didn't want to eat. And it was true, all he'd done was push his food around on his plate, and this was after telling me he was so hungry he abandoned me to Todd. But when it came to telling me exactly what was bothering him, Tommy wouldn't say. I had to assume it was some kind of medical thing, because why the hell else would he just be going to call his mom and dad and ask if they'd come get him the next morning? I practically begged him not to go, and to wait and see how he felt later that day. But Tommy was adamant. He felt awful and he needed to go home. Now, I was devastated, but after going through the stages of grief over the course of about an hour, I just landed on acceptance. I put on a happy face and then tried to make sure Tommy's final day at camp was a good one. And while I was kind of successful in that front, the rest of that day was still kind of awkward. Tommy never did get his spark back. He was just too preoccupied with something, and I figured it was my job to just be a good friend and distract from it as best I could. But since Tommy was down, I was down too, so it wasn't long before Counselor Ryan, the guy who first greeted me when I arrived at the camp, came over to see what was up. Ryan was pretty much everyone's favorite counselor and had this total big brother vibe about him. He was good at sports, definitely had that jock feel about him, but at the same time he was warm, approachable, and made sure no one felt left out or ignored. I really looked up to the guy, so when he came around and asked if everything with me and Tommy was okay, he'd also seen me yelling at Tommy, I basically poured my heart out. I said he was acting weird, that he wanted to go home and that something was bothering him, but he wouldn't tell me what. Ryan then gave me what could have been a movie monologue saying I was a good friend, Tommy was lucky to have me, and that everything would turn out just fine if I acted with integrity and always told the truth. Now, 11-year-old me ate that up, especially coming from Ryan, and then the rest of the days seemed that little bit brighter. And like I said, Tommy was much quieter than usual. So after dinner, there was no staying up late and whispering between bunks. But then for a second night in a row, when I woke up in the middle of the night to go take a pee, Tommy was not in his bunk. Now that time, I knew that I wouldn't see him on the way to the bathroom. That's not where he was going, but as I was creeping through the darkness outside, calling out Tommy's name somewhere between a yell and a whisper, I heard that skin-crawling, high-pitched whine again. It scared the hell out of me, but I didn't run that time. I stayed silent and still, waited to hear it again, and then realized it was coming from the teepees near the pavilion. I crept towards them, then heard the whining sound a third time, only on that occasion, I heard a grown man say something like, "Shush." It was definitely coming from inside one of the teepees, and although I was scared out of my mind, my desire to help Tommy spurred me forward. I almost wasn't surprised to see him when I opened up that teepee, but I was surprised to see Counselor Todd in there with him, and I was especially surprised to see Todd standing there, wearing nothing but socks. I was so shocked I dropped the tent flap, and then went running off towards the counselor's cabins, only to find that none other than Counselor Ryan was headed towards me. You can imagine how relieved I was to see him, right? How he might as well have been Superman walking over to save the day. Well, imagine that feeling and double it. When he asked me what was wrong, I told him Tommy and Counselor Todd were in the teepee together, and at first Ryan was just like, "Okay, and?" But then I was obviously like, Todd is naked in there." But instead of being horrified or even asking me to clarify what I'd said because he couldn't believe his ears, Ryan just said, "That's cool, buddy. Me and you can go have some grown-up fun too if you want." I'd never smelled alcohol on anyone's breath before. Not like I did then, anyway. My dad only ever drank beer, and only after me and my sister had gone to bed. But even today, that smell brings me back to that dark night at Camp Choctaw, and the horror I felt after Counselor Ryan asked me to join him. It was me who couldn't believe what I just heard, not just because of what it entailed, but because I'd never had anyone talk to me like that before. All I could do was stand there, dumbstruck with horror, until Ryan reached out and tried to take me by the arm. And that's when my soul returned to my body, I guess, and his touch had me recoiling like his fingers were made of hot coals. I couldn't bring myself to scream. I don't know why, but I just couldn't. I felt like I was in a dream. I didn't want people to know what had happened, and I mean, not at first anyway. So I just ran back to my bunk, curled up against my sleeping bag, and just laid there for hours. Trapped in this waking nightmare of reliving what happened over and over in my head. And by the time morning rolled around and the head counselor came over to speak with me about that previous night, I couldn't bring myself to talk about it. I couldn't even look at Tommy, who by then had walked past me with his bag towards the counselor's building, where he was due to be picked up by his parents. And I couldn't bring myself to look at Counselor Ryan either, not as the head said he heard that I had a bad dream. I just nodded along. "Yeah, sorry for scaring everybody." And it was twice as horrific because I suddenly found myself where Tommy was, or still was, trapped in this cage of not being able to talk about it for what were a bunch of different reasons. Fear, shame, disgust, you name it. I then did the same thing as Tommy and lied that I was feeling so sick that I needed my parents. And I had to wait until the afternoon for Dad to get there, but he didn't need much convincing when I talked to him over the phone. I guess he could hear it in my voice. That fear and shame and disgust that I mentioned. Fathers know their sons like that, then almost as soon as we're on the highway and Camp Choctaw was in the rear window, I broke down crying. Telling my mom and dad about what happened was easier than I thought it would be, I guess because of that safety I felt. But the thing that had me bursting into tears over and over was the thought of Tommy having to tell his parents what happened, because he was obviously in a way worse situation. Now, we had swapped phone numbers long before we both left camp, so I was able to give Tommy's number to my father, and he contacted Tommy's parents immediately, and I remember feeling as if everything was going to be fine. Dad was going to fix everything, and in that omnipotent parental way that seems like magic to kids who don't know how the world works yet. I remember Mom hugging me, and the mute sound of Dad's voice while he talked on the phone in his office. He was in there for a while, but when he came out, I figured everything had been fixed. But I was wrong. Dad came back into my bedroom and in so many words asked me, tactfully, if I made the whole thing up. He didn't outright accuse me of lying because I think he knew that I believed something had happened to Tommy, but when he put the same thing to Tommy's parents and they asked their son, he denied everything. I couldn't believe it at the time. And now it makes all the sense in the world to me, but in the moment, I couldn't understand why Tommy would be cool with the counselors not being punished for what they did to him. I tried telling my dad that it was Tommy who was lying, which made everything all the worse because it was like me versus him by that point. I knew he'd hate me for trying to tell the truth when all he wanted to do was move on and pretend it never happened, but I couldn't just stay quiet. Sometimes I wonder if I should have just moved on and forgotten about it instead of turning a whole year of my life into this slow nightmare with no end in sight. But as they used to say to knights back in the day, always tell the truth, even if it leads to your death. At least that's what I tell myself to keep the doubt and regret at bay. Dad didn't give up. He and Mom believed me, and they even said years later that what Tommy and his parents said didn't wash. They said it was that classic sort of victim in denial thing, whereas I was able to talk about it because I hadn't actually been violated. Dad was the one who adopted the whole thing as like his own personal cause, one he'd fight to the bitter end. And while that might sound like a nice thing to say, the reality of that bitter end left an even more bitter taste. Regardless of whether Tommy was going to tell the truth or not, Dad got in touch with the cops and relayed everything I'd said to them. That kicked off this whole investigation side of things, and I had to go talk to some police lady for hours in some cozy, colorful family room, which was supposed to make me feel safe and comfortable. Well, it didn't work, and I had a major panic attack when I got to the part where Ryan made a move on me. I only cried when I described seeing Tommy in the teepee with Todd. It made me feel sick to my stomach, but I was able to talk about it with her. But then once I got to the Ryan part, it was like I was right there again, standing in the dark and smelling the booze on his breath, and all I wanted to do was run. When it was all over, I'd given my statement in full. Everyone kept telling me how brave I'd been and how everything was going to be just fine. But, and just like with Ryan's little movie monologue speech, that was a lie too. I didn't know what was coming, and no one took the time to warn me either, I guess because how the hell do you even explain a thing like that to an 11-year-old? Sit them down and say, oh, by the way, no one's going to believe you and there's going to be a huge campaign to make us out to be crazy liars to try and scam a summer camp out of their hard-earned cash. Nah, they wouldn't understand, and so no one tried. The first I heard of any pushback, Dad was screaming at Mom in the kitchen one day when I got home from my friends. Their mom gave me a ride, and when I walked inside, I thought Dad was mad at Mom for some reason, but he wasn't. He was mad at something he read in the paper. According to some reporter, Camp Choctaw had conducted a full and thorough investigation of their counselor's conduct, and had concluded that no wrongdoing whatsoever had taken place. They welcomed any kind of police investigation and claimed they'd fully cooperate, but when push came to shove, there just wasn't enough evidence or testimony without Tommy. And the more my dad pushed them to change their mind, the harder they pushed back. Then in the end, the cops said if he didn't leave them alone, he'd be charged with harassment. We had to basically hold out hope that Tommy was going to change his mind, tell the truth, and allow us to bring both a lawsuit against Camp Choctaw and charges against its counselors. But while we're waiting, the wave of negative stories hit. Someone wrote into one of the papers claiming to be a relative of an accused counselor and basically saying we were liars trying to extort Camp Choctaw. The story even made it on the air when some talk show host ran a phone-in about it. Some people fought in our corner, saying the police ought to do more to encourage victims to come forward, but others said all kinds of crazy stuff about us, like how my dad had only taken a dislike to Camp Choctaw because it revered native culture and taught respect for those that came before. I cannot overemphasize what complete nonsense that was, and I also can't overemphasize how furious it made my dad. But not just furious either. He got legitimately depressed over it. He drank more, he took time off of work because of the stress, and it was a terrible time for everyone involved, but I guess none more so than Tommy. He ended up moving out of state with his family. We got no warning. Me and him never spoke again after we climbed into our bunks on that last night of camp. And we heard it through the newspaper when someone wrote about how the silent witness, as they called him, had moved on for good. My family ended up moving too, mostly because Dad had his reputation absolutely shredded in the media, with a pretty prominent columnist calling him a racist who'd ruin his own son's life in the hopes of lining his pockets. He's had a personal prejudice against reporters ever since, at least certain kinds, and to be honest, I can't blame him either. If the media had taken our side, things might have ended up way different. I think that's what would have pushed Tommy to make the right decision and made sure the people that hurt him got what's coming to them. But whatever chance he had of changing his mind will have been snuffed out the first time he heard about the counter-accusations, saying how we were being coached by our parents so they could pocket some cash. Now, the whole thing probably marks the sorest and lowest point of my entire life, and although me and Tommy might not be able to get justice anymore, it doesn't mean no one can. I guess the whole point of telling this story all these years later is to tell people how, if stuff like this happens, you need to talk about it. Even if you get called a liar and people say the worst stuff imaginable about you, you can't give up. Not just because you owe it to yourself, but because you owe it to the other victims too. The ones who weren't able to get justice for themselves and punishment for their abusers. Keep talking. Time is on your side, and as the old saying goes, lies run sprints, but the truth runs marathons. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember to cake fart on your birthday. Just over 2 years ago now, I got a call from an old friend's wife. I thought it'd be her and my old friend Luke passing on some belated Christmas wishes, as I hadn't seen either of them over the festive period. It marked the first time in almost 20 years that I hadn't seen him during that time, but for that, there was a very reasonable explanation. The week before Christmas, Luke's mom had suddenly passed away. He and his family were devastated, so instead of doing the usual and spending every spare moment down at the pub, he very understandably wanted to have a quiet Christmas. The funeral had been small, a family affair, and so when the name of Luke's wife popped up on my phone, I was excited to hear from her and my old friend. But as it turned out, Luke wasn't there, and in fact, he'd gone missing. Sarah said it wasn't so much Luke's absence that worried her, it was what he'd said before he left. He was still grieving, so the idea of him needing some time alone was understandable, but when Sarah said he mentioned something about talking to an angel, my jaw dropped. Sarah asked where he was going and why, and Luke only told her, "You wouldn't understand," or "You wouldn't believe me." Sarah then said she wouldn't let him leave until he told her where he was going, and when Luke replied, "To talk to an angel," She was too stunned to stop him as he shoved his way past her with a bag full of supplies and some spare clothes. When she asked if I knew what that meant, I said yes, that I did, and that while I couldn't promise anything, I had a pretty good idea where I could find him, and not only would I tell her where that was, I'd do one better. I'd drive all the way up to Scotland, and I'd bring Luke home myself. Sarah was worried Luke had gone insane, and while I didn't know if that was the case, I knew that if we got the police involved, Luke might end up getting into some serious trouble. Now, we didn't want him locked in a cell or doing 30 days in a mental health unit if all he needed was just a nice hug. And if he needed serious treatment, then sure, we could go down that road if we needed to. But both me and Sarah agreed that the best thing to do was to find him before he got himself into trouble. And not just the legal kind either, more like trouble from the weather. Sarah noticed how Luke was packing some camping gear into his car before he left. Another thing which frightened her because where was he planning on camping in the middle of bloody winter? She had no idea, but I did. Like I said, Scotland. More than 20 years before, when myself, Luke, and two friends of ours were all either 21 and 22, we went on a camping trip to Ayrshire. We drove out to a place called Loch Braden, set up a campsite near the loch's edge, and then spent a few days roasting chestnuts on an open fire, getting piss drunk and hoping it would snow. And yes, you heard that right. We didn't head out camping in the summertime like normal people. We went 2 days after Christmas because we felt cheated out of a white one and fancied an excuse to booze it up around a warm, crackling fire. Now, I know that probably sounds mental to some people who'd rightly assume winter camping to be a pretty terrible idea, but we were young, dumb, and full of such terrible ideas. And so off we went. It didn't snow while we were there, but we did find a chestnut tree, and now the taste forever reminds me of freezing my balls off up in Scotland. It was worth it for the fire and booze and the banter, though, and it wasn't just beer and vodka keeping our own fires burning, if you know what I mean. We were passing spliffs back and forth, but not Luke. Luke didn't do anything like that, so nothing but alcohol passed his lips. Or at least, it seemed that way, right up until the point he just sort of walked off. Now, me and our two friends were absolutely bombed, so while we were splitting our sides over absolute nonsense, Luke seemed to be on a different wavelength. I kept an eye on him to make sure that he was doing okay, and he didn't seem sad, but over time he got quieter and quieter until eventually he just got up and walked off on his own. We called out to him, asking where he was going, because we'd usually announce if we were going for a piss or whatever, for safety purposes, I suppose. But Luke didn't say anything, and we had to call out and ask where he was going just to be told, just going for a walk. Now, me and our two pals started poking fun at him and saying he was slinking off to take the knock, as we called it, which just means vomiting after drinking or smoking too much. Now, I thought that he'd be back in a few minutes, but I think maybe an hour flew by with us just laughing away before we realized that Luke still hadn't come back. Now, we started panicking a bit, because our mobiles were useless out there in the middle of nowhere, so off we went with our torches to go looking for Luke. Now, it got quite scary at times, and not just because we were so drunk and stoned, but because reality started to become something of an elastic concept at times. That was mostly my fault, and that admission will make a lot more sense later. But for now, let me quickly reassure you by saying that we found Luke, safe and sound, and got him back to the campsite. Now, we were all knackered by then, and so not long after getting back to camp, we got into our sleeping bags and let the campfire burn down as we got some much-needed rest. But then, as we're all lying there in our tents and there's nothing but quiet and stillness, Luke spoke up in this obviously drunken voice and said something like, "Guys, I saw an angel out there." Now, he said it so sincerely that we all just sort of burst out laughing. One of our friends, Ben, replied asking, "Bloody hell, mate, how much you had to drink?" Now, our other friend was laughing, saying, "You saw a Christmas angel, did you? My arse you did. The angel flew out of those lagers you were drinking." Now, Luke insisted he wasn't mistaken, but sounded like he was on the verge of passing out, and then once the laughter died down, we all just sort of slowly fell asleep. Now, the next day, we packed away the camping gear and agreed on a nice fried breakfast in a cafe before heading home. We poked a bit of fun at Luke over his claim that he'd seen an angel, but he took it on the chin with a very much, "Fine, you don't have to believe me kind of attitude. Now, I assumed Luke might feel a bit embarrassed and was all too willing to move on from his little sighting, but he didn't. In fact, over the next year or so, the angel sighting seemed to be the basis for Luke's newfound faith. He didn't turn into a complete Bible thumper or anything like that, and since he didn't shove it down our throats or anything, me and his other friends were just kind of like, whatever floats your boat, pal. Some came to believe that whenever Luke talked about the angel, he was weaving a kind of metaphor about finding God up in Scotland one Christmas after having a bit too much to drink. But I knew Luke wasn't talking in metaphors. He really did think that he'd seen an angel. And so when he told his wife that he was going to talk to one, I had a pretty good idea of where he was heading. And that place was Loch Braden, the same place that we'd gone camping all those years before. I rang into work, told them I needed a few days off of work for personal reasons, and then drove up to Ayrshire first thing in the morning. I then reached Loch Braden by about 1:30 in the afternoon, and there was snow at the time, not much of it, but enough to give it that proper desolate look. And I can't say it was enjoyable though, because strong winds meant that it was absolutely freezing, and I had to bundle up against the cold before heading out in search of Luke. I didn't wander around the loch calling out his name. Instead, I was laser guided towards the place we'd camped at all those years earlier, and when I found it, there stood a dark green tent with a dead campfire and a few bits of camping equipment sitting near the entrance. I called out to Luke asking, "Are you there, mate?" But the tent was empty. I had no way of knowing if the tent was really his, not until I found the Bible he had sitting next to a rolled-up sleeping bag, and then I knew. I then spent the next hour or so wandering around the snowy woods calling out Luke's name, but when I didn't find him, I wandered back to his camp and decided to wait for him there while I got a fire going to keep warm. It was almost dark by the time I heard footsteps approaching, and at first I was a bit nervous that it wouldn't be Luke. But it was, and since I already had a feeling that he wouldn't be pleased to see me, I wasn't surprised when he wasn't. No, I said something to him like, "Hey mate," and was about to offer an explanation as to why I was there, but Luke cut me off by asking who told me where he was. Now, I didn't want to get his back up by treating him like a kid. I wanted cooperation, so that's what I went with, and told him Sarah was worried about him. He didn't get angry or anything, not yet, because he knew we were just concerned about him, but Luke did let me know, and very firmly, that he wouldn't be leaving till he talked to his angel. I honestly couldn't tell if he had gone crackers or not, so I tried to test him in my own little way on little bits of info. I asked him how long he'd been there, what route he'd taken on the drive up, and what he'd said to Sarah before leaving. All his answers seemed kind of lucid, and he didn't mention any kind of wild conspiracy theories or anything delusional like that, and he didn't go off on any religious rants either. He said he didn't expect me, his wife, or anyone else to understand, but he needed to find his guardian angel because he needed to get a message to his mum. And when he said that last part, it felt almost like a punch to the gut. Or maybe that's the wrong way of describing it, but it was just such a sad but almost sort of relatable thing to want. Like I said earlier, Luke's mom had suddenly passed away, and he was understandably taking that very badly. But it wasn't a question of what he was doing being healthy or not, or if what was happening was something much more damaging. It was a question of what Luke was going to do when I told him the truth. We had a nice long chat about the camp trip that we went on, and then touched on how his mom's funeral had been. It was nice to reminisce, but seeing him grieving so deeply was very tough. But then as we continued talking over a campfire supper and the darkness fully crept in, we got talking about Luke's angel and what it may or may not have been. Again, he was weirdly reasonable about it and didn't expect anyone to understand. It was just something that he had to do so he could be at peace with his mom's passing. But then, I asked how he'd feel if I could guarantee he wouldn't find his angel again, because it was my fault he thought he'd seen one in the first place. Luke just sort of laughed, because the very idea that it was me that was responsible for him seeing his angel was laughable. But the only reason he didn't full-on belly laugh, at least in my opinion, was the look on my face when suggesting it. Because I wasn't joking. In fact, I was very serious. Because the reason Luke wandered off in a daze like he did, and the reason he believed that he saw an angel, was because I put a tiny bit of LSD in his alcohol when he went off for a piss. He was already drunk and he was drinking some cheap piss, so he didn't pick up on the taste at first, and I thought it'd have a funnier effect on him, but I guess it didn't. And when he didn't come back when he thought he would, I felt very personally responsible. No one but me knew I brought any, and I was planning on telling him that what I'd done come bedtime or the next morning. But after we, or should I say I, almost lost Luke, I decided not to tell anyone what I'd done for fear of the backlash. And then as the years went by, I felt more and more guilty about what I'd done. So much so that when Luke's wife told me that he'd put himself in danger by camping up in Scotland in the middle of winter, I felt personally responsible. It might have only been a snort, but Luke laughed when I suggested I was responsible for his angel sighting. But when I mentioned the acid that I'd slipped into his beer, not even trace of amusement was visible in his face. He went full-on denial mode and argued that I was only saying that to get him to come home. Now, I suppose I should make it clear to anyone reading this that I wasn't just making it up, and I really did put drugs in my friend's drink. My defense at the time was that it wasn't much. Enough to get him loosey-goosey, but not full-on tripping. But that's no excuse, I know that, because that one stupid joke had altered Luke's whole reality. And although he completely refused to accept it at first, that didn't last long. I think the thing that really pushed him over the edge was when I started describing his symptoms back to him. I told him that although he was quiet, I was worried about him because I knew the dose that I'd given him would serve as a real mood enhancer. And I also knew that he'd walked away from the fire at first because it was too bright for him. First-time trips can be like that, especially if you don't know what's going on. And I added it was me who initiated the Luke's going to vomit joke, partly to try and distract from the fact that I'd dosed him. I told him whatever he'd seen out there, be it a trick of the light or a big bird of prey passing over the face of the moon, his imagination had taken hold of it and turned it into something it wasn't. I was halfway into explaining how I knew it couldn't have been some full-on hallucination because I'd given him such a low dosage when Luke just charged me. He didn't shout or scream, he just started attacking me in a complete frenzy, punching and kicking till I was on the ground and curled up in a ball shouting, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry." I did try and defend myself at first, purely on instinct, I suppose. But as you can imagine, it was a complete mismatch in terms of how angry he was versus how sorry I was. And when he stopped kicking me, Luke dropped to his knees and kind of rolled me over. I thought he was going to start punching me in the face, but instead, his hands went for my throat, and he started to strangle me. I reached up to try and claw his fingers away from my neck, and then I tried grabbing his arms at the elbows to drag them away, but neither thing worked. And it was then that I had this horrible moment of realization that this was how I was going to die. Murdered up in Scotland by one of my oldest friends because I'd revealed his entire belief system was the result of nothing more than a prank. I don't think I deserved to die for something like that, but in the moment, I had a very dark sense of, I get it. I brought this on myself. I still tried to get his hands off of me, but all that rage in him, it was like it gave him super strength or something. And I think it was only the thoughts of the consequences that made him stop. And by that I mean if he thought he could have gotten away with killing me, I'm not sure Luke would have let go. But he did. And when he did, it was like taking my very first breath of life all over again. I've never known a lungful like that, but I could feel how puffy and hot my face was from how red it had turned. And all the I'm sorry's got replaced with thank yous, because it was clear he'd just spared my life. But Luke wasn't ready to let bygones be bygones, and after pacing back and forth for a minute straight, still in a rage, he told me to do one, meaning get lost. I remember wanting to ask him if he was sure we couldn't just talk it out, but I knew that'd be a waste of breath. I'd never seen him that angry before, and not that I deserved it, but I knew that there'd be no reasoning with him at this point. Luke saw me hesitating to leave and then came at me shouting to F off and making out like he was going to hit me. And so I did as he asked and left. I walked back to my car, feeling the aches from Luke's punches and kicks and the soreness in my throat, and then drove back home, and we never spoke since. I called his wife from a service station and filled her in on everything that had happened. I put off telling her about the spiking incident for as long as I could, but when I did, she did a kind of verbal double take in asking me to repeat myself. And when I did, she immediately hung up. There was no anger, no insults. She just hung up the phone, and that was the last time I spoke to her, too. I understand why they've chosen to cut me off. I just hope that one day they find it in their hearts to forgive me. And if Luke still has his faith after I told him, then I hope that'll one day be the case. Because after thinking about it for quite a while, and I think that in a way, Luke really did find his angel out there at that old Ayrshire campsite, and when it spoke to him and told him to spare my life, he listened. My name's Allison. I'm from Seattle, and while it took me way longer than I wanted to, I'm finally ready to send this over. For the longest time, I had a friend named Chris, and Chris suffered from persistent depressive disorder. It started after he lost his job, got violently mugged, and then got really sick with some kind of viral infection, all while his relationship with his fiancée was falling apart around him. He ended up moving back in with his parents up near Richmond Beach for a while, and then after finding it harder and harder to get out of bed and leave the house every day, Chris just sort of stopped trying. He was put on various cocktails of medication in the hopes one might work, but nothing did, and for a while he just rotted away indoors. But then in early spring of 2019, Chris asked if I wanted to go get sushi. He was online a lot, which was pretty much the only way we kept in touch, so hearing from him wasn't a shock. But hearing that he wanted to meet in person, that came as a real surprise. I accepted the invitation, and while he still had a whiff of hermit about him, he seemed way, way better than before. I didn't question it. I was just too happy to see progress. But at the same time, I knew that there had to be something going on in Chris's life to prompt such an improvement in him. I'd be damned if I wasn't going to figure out what it was. The day after we met for sushi, I asked Chris what had changed, like if he'd been doing or taking something new. And he said he'd found a kind of support group that met once a week, and since he started going, he'd been feeling a lot better about life. They met in a coffee shop, but they didn't sit in a circle, doing land acknowledgements and using therapy language. It was more like show up, hang out, and just talk to people for real. And that was usually a little talk at the end by the group's organizer, but that consisted of nothing more than a poem and maybe the odd announcement. It was very informal, very laid back, and for the first time in a long time, Chris found the confidence to start living his life again. Now, this was obviously great to hear, so I asked about it, and Chris said the group was called Mother's Love. It seemed so crazy to me that after all the medication and all the therapy, that Chris really just needed some connection, you know? I don't take it to heart that we as friends couldn't do that for him either, because Chris needed new connections with new people as concrete evidence that he could place faith in his fellow humans again. Sometimes I'd ask him about the group, and that's how I found out that they didn't have any kind of online presence, because they didn't want a whole bunch of people turning up and killing the vibe. It was supposed to be intimate and meaningful, so it was down to attendees to exercise discretion in who they invited. I had to wait months until late December of that same year, 2019, to get anything resembling an invite. But when that invite came, it was not in the form I expected it to be. When Chris asked if I was still interested in getting involved, I told him I didn't know about involved, but I sure did want to stop by so I could check it out. And that's when he told me about the winter retreat. According to him, Mother's Love had reached a point where expansion was starting to make sense, so each current member had been instructed to pick out a +1 for a weekend of camping. And then to incentivize their attendance, the whole weekend of the retreat would be entirely free for that +1. And at first I wasn't sure, because spending 2 nights in a tent together in the freezing cold did not sound like my idea of fun. But when Chris told me it'd be more like glamping, as in like super warm tents with super fancy features, I totally had to reconsider. He said the food would be all vegan, which was awesome, and that the open bar on Saturday night would be a really fun way of making new friends while getting lit for free. Well, that about sealed it for me, and I promptly prepared myself for a weekend of winter camping. We arrived at what amounted to a luxury campground on Friday afternoon, and it was totally amazing. They had showers, a bar that served hot food, and then a kind of conference and party room. And the tents? They were more like miniature cabins. They had covered floors, a heater, separate sleeping compartments, thank God to be honest, and a little communal space with squishy log pillows to sit on. We didn't just have super cozy, faux fur-lined sleeping bags either. We were giving these heavy, memory foam sleeping mattresses as well, and they were super squishy and soft. It was definitely not what sprang to mind when I thought free camping weekend, but I also remember wondering, who the hell put all the money up for this? And I definitely wasn't about to question it though, so I just sort of went with it. Now, once we were all settled in, one of the retreat's organizers stopped by mine and Chris's tent and asked us to attend a little conference hall for the welcoming ceremony. We found about 30 people in the conference hall before Chris started introducing me to some of the people he knew. We chatted for a while, making introductions, and finally, an older lady took to the podium and asked for our attention. She introduced herself as Mary, and then after welcoming all the newcomers to Mother's Love, she touched on some topics that we'd be discussing over the next 48 hours or so. And only then did I realize that Chris hadn't told me the whole story. I don't want to rehash everything that Mary lady said because she talked for 45 minutes, but most of it was about the seminars, and this is the gist of it. There was one about maintaining a low impact on the environment, which was all well and good, but then there was one about anti-natalism, which turned out to be a fancy word for thinking having babies is wrong or something. And when I asked Chris about that afterwards, he said some people believe the earth is so overpopulated that it's messing up the environment. But I thought Chris's group was just coffee and pancakes, not hardcore political stuff. And Chris said it didn't start out that way. It was just something that they all got talking about over time. But there seemed to be a dramatic difference between the seminar on centering oneself in nature and the one I think was titled The Death March of Western Capitalism. Now, I thought we were going to be drinking cocoa around a campfire and going on nature walks, but Chris just kind of shrugged it off. He said he wasn't really into the political stuff either, so we could just sit it out if I wanted to and head off on that nature walk when I was excited to. And then I asked him about something Mary had said when she was introducing herself, and his response wasn't nearly so reassuring. And so when Mary, the organizer lady, introduced herself, she said a number in the 300s, and then ppm, and I'm thinking, huh? What? In my head, but she just breezed right past it without explaining. Chris said that Mary and a lot of the regulars didn't use numbers to describe their birth years. They used ppm, which, after double-checking it, definitely stands for parts per million, and then the number describes how much CO2 there was in the atmosphere during that year. And so, when Mary said, I was born in 300 whatever ppm, she meant the 50s or something. And I remember thinking, bro, what the heck, this is goofy as hell. Because, yeah, screw the oil companies, dude, sure, but using ppm instead of just saying your birth year, just a bunch of weirdos. But Chris didn't think it was all that funny. I mean, he smiled, but he didn't seem to think it was dumb like I did. And then I asked him if he knew what ppm he was born at. Then, without skipping a beat, he then says 352. He laughed at my reaction and said he didn't go around telling people like Mary and the others. It was just something he Googled one time out of interest and then happened to remember. And I remember feeling like I'd kind of let him down because it was definitely not going to be able to sit through a whole bunch of political seminars. But he said not to worry, that we'd just go to the ones that sounded interesting to me. And then we went over to dinner and got talking about some of the other campers. And that part was actually super fun. I'm a really social butterfly, so getting to meet everyone was cool. Dinner was great too, and we had vegan Indian food and a few drinks, and then after more of that political talk from Mary, we all went back to our tents to enjoy our early night before an early start. Now, I won't bore you with everything we did that next day because it was a lot. But it was actually super chill until dinner that evening when we started to get hyped about the party with all the free booze. But before we went off to our tents again to get ready, Mary had an announcement to make. She said the next morning all the retreat's male attendees would be entitled to receive a gift, a blessing of Mother Nature in fact, and it was entirely free. Unfortunately, the same gift would not be bestowed on female attendees, but that was something that they were looking into, and anyone interested should approach an organizer with their queries. There was a lot of confused female faces, but also notice how not all the girls there looked confused. Some of them looked like they knew exactly why, and that should have been my first big clue right there. Well, heading back to the glamping tent to get ready for the party, I asked Chris what this free gift was all about. Chris said that he had to talk to me about something, but I asked if it could wait because by that point my curiosity was burning. But then Chris said it was that very same free gift he wanted to talk to me about, and so I'm thinking, okay, go on, and when he told me, I remember my jaw dropping, because Chris told me that free gift was a vasectomy. Now, I thought he was joking, and while Chris was smiling, it wasn't in a jokey way, more like in a this is good news kind of way. As it turns out, I had no idea this was the case till Chris went through it with me, but a vasectomy is actually a super simple procedure. Guys only need a local anesthetic, and then a trained professional can render a dude infertile with just a single needle-thin puncture to a guy's taint. It's not a major surgery, and while a guy definitely needs to rest up and avoid serious exercise or exertion, it's not like he's going to be held up in a hospital bed for a week like a woman after her hysterectomy. And so after I told Chris, no way, dude, they can't do surgeries out here, that's impossible, he made it clear that not only was it very possible, but he was planning on getting the snip, as he called it, that very next morning. And I'm like, this is a joke, right? But Chris wasn't kidding. He said what brought him so much hope was the idea no one else would have to suffer like he did. His parents had brought him into the world against his will, without ever considering whether he might be happy or not. And that was a mistake he wasn't going to repeat. Knowing he wouldn't be able to reproduce made him feel like he was doing something to solve the problem, even if it was just one small but significant act. Now, I'm sure a lot of heartless psychos are going to read this and say, Chris was making a choice about his body, how dare you try and prevent that? Well, first off, go jump in a dumpster. And while you're in there, lying among the trash where you belong, consider that I wasn't objecting to him getting a piercing or getting frosted tips or whatever. I was objecting to him getting a mother-freaking vasectomy. Oh, but what's that I hear you cry? Oh, people from the trash? You can reverse a vasectomy. That is indeed true, but then riddle me this, dumpster dude. Does the reversal involve actual knock-you-out surgery and reopening the old vasectomy scar? Well, yes, it does. And is the surgery always successful? No, it's not. And while I didn't know that till I Googled it in a panic, I sure as heck showed it to Chris when I did. And if he didn't want to have kids, he could put a damned hood on it, or the 100 other not-safe-for-work things people do to make sure their humps don't mean bumps, as they say. But no, Chris had made his mind up. He wanted his little sacred rights so he could respect his mother's love, and there was nothing I could do to convince him otherwise. But on that, he was wrong. Rather than go into the whole drama of what happened when we were drunk, I'll just cut to the important part. We got plastered on all that free alcohol, and while I tried my very best to drop the whole vasectomy objection and just enjoy our time together, that obviously proved impossible. I got fixated on the idea the root of his motivation was destructive, not constructive, and that maybe he wasn't as mentally well as he thought he was. When we went somewhere quiet to talk, I told him how he had zero clue what was going to happen in the future, and how he might well live to regret his decision, especially if reversing the process failed and he was made infertile for good. Now he's drunk and says, "What's the point? What woman would ever want to have kids with me?" And so I told him lots of women would, maybe even myself, because, like I said, you never know how the future's going to unfold. Now, we didn't immediately start making out like in the movie or anything, but I thought I actually got through to him after saying how once he was done putting himself together and had a job and took care of himself, then he was attracted enough that plenty of girls would want to date him. And after that, we hugged it out, and he thanked me for not just being his plus one, but being a good friend and giving him hope. Now, I'll admit, that made me tear up and cry a little, but I was also super smashed, so there was that. We went back to the party, had a couple of more drinks to lift our spirits again, and then we went back to our tent and went to sleep, in our own separate sleeping compartments. Now, my memory of those last couple of hours is kind of hazy, I'll be honest, but what I do remember is going to sleep with the knowledge that one of my best friends was not about to do something potentially irreversible. But when I woke up the next morning, Chris wasn't in the tent. I put on a bunch of warm clothes and went looking for him, but was so hungover that I only got a few steps out of our glamping tent before I ran into a tree and started puking while leaning against it. Now after that, and once I sort of cleaned myself up, I went looking for Chris, but found the atmosphere in the camp to be way different than before. During the previous 2 days, whenever we went anywhere, everyone was saying, "Hey, how's it going?" to us, and were generally super friendly. But when I walked around the camp that morning, everyone just sort of stared at me in total silence. I mean, they whispered and talked among themselves as I passed, but they wouldn't say anything to me, and they wouldn't return my fake, panicking but pretending to be friendly smiles. Now, I kept asking, "Has anyone seen Chris?" But no one would answer me, and it took until I found one of the organizers before I got any kind of explanation. The conference room was being used as the surgery, and I could already see a couple of guys sitting in the little waiting area through a large window, but I couldn't see Chris. And that's when I was approached by that same girl who welcomed us on the first day and was asked to return to our tent so we could talk in private. On the way, I kept asking, "Did Chris get a vasectomy?" But she wouldn't tell me. Not until we got back to our tent when she confirmed it. Chris has gotten up that morning bright and early, and not only did he get the snip, but he was literally the first guy to get it done. He was actually resting in another tent as we spoke and was kept separate from me because of what a, quote, negative person I was being. Now, she was the first one who told me what a terrible person I was for not just being like, "Yeah, cool, no big deal, bud." And I said the same thing to her as I'd said to anyone else. "Go F yourself with a cactus, you psychos." Chris was a vulnerable, emotionally damaged person who needed serious psychiatric care, and then as his new friends, instead of encouraging him to get it, they tricked him into a physical solution to what was a mental problem. And personally, I'll never stop hating them for that. I'll also never stop hating them for how they let people treat me as I was leaving. I cannot overstate how sickening it was to attend a seminar on feminism in Trump's America one day, and then the next, have women just standing back and smiling as grown-ass men got up in my face and screamed the C word at me so furiously that I remember their spittle landing on my cheek. I actually thought that they were going to beat me up by the time they started shoving me and throwing rocks. They didn't give a crap that I was Chris's ride either. They said that they'd find a real friend to drive him home, and I should get the hell out of there while I still could. I was shaking by the time I got to my car with my stuff, and I was in tears by the time I had the keys in the ignition. I felt like I'd enabled one of my oldest friends to do something awful to himself, and then by the time I realized what was even happening, it was too late, and I'd done too little to stop it. Chris and I haven't spoken since. I've tried to reach out, but he doesn't want to now. I don't even care if he got a vasectomy anymore. I mean, it's his body, his choice, right? But I just wish he'd stop punishing me for trying to play the devil's advocate and convince him that a permanent solution to a temporary problem might not have been the way to go, and that weird cult that he joined is very, very weird. So Chris, if you're out there, call me. I miss you. My name is Alf. I'm a fan from Sweden, and today I would like to tell you my very own true scary story about the most frightening experience of my whole life. I joined the army when I was 18, and I loved being a soldier. Well, when I was 23, I was diagnosed with a rare medical disorder and had to be discharged. I was devastated, and while I eventually adjusted to a new routine, I still miss being in the field very much. I ended up asking a couple of my old school friends if they'd like to go camping sometime, and while most thought that that was a great idea, they didn't so much enjoy the specifics of my idea. For obvious reasons, most camping here takes place in the summertime, but I didn't want to go in the summertime. I wanted to go in the freezing Swedish winter. Most people thought that I was crazy, and were saying, "No thanks, friend, I'm out." Others said that they'd consider it and then dropped out one by one as the days ticked down to D-Day. In the end, the only person left who was dead set on joining me was an old friend of ours who'd moved to a different city, a friend named Varg. Varg wasn't really named Varg, it was his nickname he gave himself, meaning wolf, which should give you an instant idea of what he was like as a person. And well, despite it, I can safely tell you that he was even worse than you might imagine. If we hadn't been such close friends for so long, there's no way that I'd have tolerated behavior like Varg's. And honestly, I think him moving to Bergen for a girl that he met online actually saved our friendship, and he wasn't around to act like a jackwad anymore. He would drink and drive, get into big fights with his girlfriend, and post all about it on Facebook, and he was constantly getting fired from menial jobs for doing the stupidest things, like drinking openly on the job or sleeping on shift and then getting angry when his colleagues woke him up. And like I said, I definitely wouldn't have been friends with him had I met him yesterday, but for the most part, we actually got along quite well. We had a similar sense of humor, we both enjoyed the same sort of movies and music, and we both had a big passion for outdoor survival scenarios. And that's how I ended up thinking that just me and Varg, a winter camping trip, might actually be a good time. But one of the real pros of camping in the winter was the lack of bears, which usually hibernate between late autumn and the very late spring. Now, I still insisted that we hang some bear bait somewhere away from the camp, but it didn't help, and even though we went camping in late February, we were unfortunate enough to be found by a bear who'd woken up too early and was desperate to find food. We woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of a huge brown bear sniffing around our camp, having eaten the bait and went looking for more. We rushed out of the tent, yelling and screaming at it in the darkness to scare it away. It appeared to work at first and the bear backed off, but then it sort of false charged and tricked me into stumbling backwards so awkwardly I actually sprained my ankle pretty badly. Thankfully, it was just a false charge, otherwise I'd have been in very serious trouble. But even though we managed to scare it off for good using the bear mace that we carried with us, we were almost out of food and my ankle was in a very sorry state. I took some painkillers and then we tried to fix up our campsite a little and salvage our food before heading back to our tent. We slept until dawn, not very well I should add, and then once it was light, Varg volunteered to find a shop somewhere so he could bring back food and some stronger painkillers. I thought that was very cool of him, like just the sort of behavior that kept me friends with him, and Varg can be a pain in the ass sometimes, but you could really rely on him when you really needed to. I stayed in the tent with my ankle raised and the bear mace at the ready, and then maybe 2.5 hours later, Varg reappeared with his pack full of stuff. Now I thought that he'd have more than some bread, bacon, and my painkillers, but when he emptied the bag inside our tent, he had all kinds of stuff with him. He had a few bottles of vodka, a whole carton of cigarettes, dozens of bars of chocolate, and a lot of elk jerky, or what we call renja snacks. Varg also had a ton of medication with him too, but not just painkillers. There were all kinds of things, from anti-allergy medicine to antacids for stomach trouble, and while I expected Varg to be pleased with himself at having brought back such a bounty, he seemed almost angry. He emptied out the bag with some force, like he was full of spite, and when I saw that strange variety of medicine tumble out onto the ground, I started to get kind of suspicious. I asked Varg where he'd gotten all that stuff, and he just said, "I found a shop." But then when I asked him why he bought and me anti-allergy medication, he snapped a little and said he just grabbed whatever he could because he needed to be fast. It made sense in a way. Varg wasn't a rich man and he wasn't generous or careless with his money, and so after a moment of thought I turned to him and asked, "Did you steal these things?" No, I knew the answer before he even said anything. He had that guilty look about him that I knew all too well, and in the past I sometimes found it funny, because you could always read his face when he'd be the one to do something wrong, like hide the teacher's chalk or put a pin on another people's chair. But that time, I didn't find it funny, and neither did Varg. He still had that angry air about him as he told me, "I didn't have enough money." And I found this outrageous, as any normal person would only buy what they could afford. But at any objection, Varg tried to defend himself by explaining what had happened. He said at first, all he did was put down the painkillers, the vodka, and the cigarettes, but he was short by just a couple of krona, our dollars here. And the lady tells him he needs more money, but Varg insisted it was an emergency and she needed to accept the amount he had. Obviously, the lady saw no emergency, just a man trying to buy vodka at like 8 in the morning, and so she told him no. Varg said he offered to come back later with the rest of the money, but sensing he probably wouldn't, the woman said no once again. And this is when Varg lost his mind. He attacked the lady, beat her till she wasn't moving anymore, and then filled his pack with anything he could grab before running out of the shop. He didn't even get help from me, he just ran before someone came along to see what he'd done. I was furious, but so was he, and if you can believe it, we argued back and forth about who was in the right. Varg insisted he did the right thing for me and him, and that was all that mattered, and to this day I still can't believe he saw things that way. And don't get me wrong, I appreciate his instinct to take care of an injured friend, but what he did to that woman was unforgivable, and we argued about it for quite a while until finally he announced that he was getting drunk. Varg couldn't go back to the little country shop that he'd found, the only one for miles around. He'd have to walk for miles and miles to some other place to get help. And the cold had completely killed our little flip phones, so we needed a landline, and then since we were way out in the middle of nowhere, Varg would have to search long and hard to find one he could use. So before that, he was going to get drunk. Now, if you imagine Varg planned on getting drunk and then getting back behind the wheel of my car, then yes, that's exactly what he's planning on doing, and this sparked another argument between us. But since it truly was a case of beggars not being able to be choosers, I had to shut my mouth, drink a little vodka to help the painkillers along, and wait until he was good and ready to help me. And there came a point when there was nothing but silence. I didn't have anything to say to him, and he didn't have anything to say to me. And then as we sat there, me eating and him smoking, I noticed a little plane flying in the sky above our heads. I didn't think much of it at first. Who would? It was just a small plane, but then minutes later, I saw it fly over us again before it started circling us. Now, for the sake of nothing but my own amusement, I started waving at it with both arms as if to say, SOS, help us. I hoped it might fly straight and dip its wings or something, like a sign that it had seen us, but not a minute later, it flew away again without any kind of signal or indication. Varg kept on drinking and smoking for maybe 10 to 15 minutes, then finally stood up on very wobbly legs and said, "Okay, time to go." I remember groaning, not in pain, but at the thought of him being pulled over, or worse, driving my car off the road and getting himself hurt. But as I looked up at him, I saw someone behind him walking towards us through the snowy trees, and he had what looked like a shotgun in his hands. Varg must have seen my expression because he turned around to check out what I was seeing, and then when he did, he yelled "run," and then started sprinting away as fast as he could. I saw the man stop and aim at us, so I tried my best to also run as I heard a single shot boom around the landscape. As per my army training, I instinctively threw myself to the ground, and then I remembered letting out a scream of pain as I felt it shoot through my ankle. I got up and tried to run again, but fell down again. I then tried crawling, but knew that I wasn't moving fast enough, and so I did the only thing I could think of and rolled onto my back to face the man approaching us and begged for my life. I knew who it was, or at least I knew why he was shooting at us. It had to be the husband or brother or son of the woman Varg had hurt, and I was right. It was her husband. He had the shotgun pointed right at me as I explained it wasn't me, that it was my friend and that I had nothing to do with it. I think the man knew this and recognized the fleeing Varg from the description he'd been given because he loaded his shotgun and fired a second time. He missed Varg completely, but I didn't know this at the time. And so in my mind, and because there was no screaming, Varg was stone dead, and I was next. I begged him over and over not to shoot me as he loaded a third shell into his shotgun, and then for just a moment, he pointed the barrel right at my face. I thought it was all over for me. I thought I was a dead man. But after I started to pray, something I hadn't done since I was a child, the man lowered the gun and then offered me a hand to help me to my feet. All I could say was, thank you, again and again. It was no platitude either, but rather it stemmed from the deepest sense of gratitude I've ever felt. The man then told me his name was Oscar, and that if I wanted to leave those woods alive, I was going to help the police find the man who had beaten his wife half to death. I told him that sounded like a good deal, and then he helped me back to his 4x4, and we drove over to his store to meet his wife, who was being treated by paramedics, and more importantly, the policeman waiting for me. I was only too happy to talk to them, partly to clear my name and partly to fulfill my promise to Oscar. I wanted to do the right thing, but I also firmly believed that if I didn't, he would find me and kill me. Varg ended up going to prison for 6 years for what he did, but I heard they let him out in 4. We haven't spoken since, and to be honest, I consider it good riddance. But there is a part of me that wonders if someday he may pay me a visit to ask why I was so willing to talk to the police about him. And without pointing too fine a point on it, if he does, he won't get to escape like he did from that woman's husband. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember to always jack your wad. I have a confession. I'm one of those people. The kind of girls who go to Starbucks and perch themselves at a table in the corner and spend the day there working. Now, in my defense, I don't sit there with a MacBook Air. I'm not a total cliche. I'm an artist and I do life drawings of things I see around the city. Never other people unless they ask or give consent, and sitting by a Starbucks window actually has a purpose. At least that's what I tell myself anyway, instead of just accepting that I'm on the cusp between millennial and Gen Z and a bit of a cliche of both. And during my almost daily visits to local Starbucks, I did notice a guy who kinda fit the cliche I'm insulting. He had an expensive, new-looking MacBook Pro, and he'd sit there throughout the day. Now occasionally he'd type a sentence or two, often deleting and rewriting them, and then deleting them again, and then going to the barista to order another coffee. Sometimes he'd read these tattered old paperbacks, and I was thrilled to see that there wasn't a Jonathan Franzen, James Joyce, or Thomas Pynchon among them, although I would have given a Pynchon a maybe. Either way, it was clear that he was as much of a literary nerd as me, but like me, and unlike much of our generation, he wasn't pretending to read Ulysses or Gravity's Rainbow. And did you know, and I found this out from a Tinder date who was funny and honest, that some men crack the spines of their intellectual books to make it look like they've read them just to impress chicks. Now I will admit, honestly, that did earn him a few more dates until he had to move out of state to look after a sick mom, and that kinda sucked. So back to Starbucks writer man, he was cute in a bookish, tousled blonde hair, slightly dad bod way, i.e. exactly my type. Now, I'm not exactly shy, and if I'm attracted to a guy, then I won't make a secret of checking him out, but I also won't make the first move. I can't completely kill the age of chivalry for 8th wave feminism or whatever wave we're on now. Now anyway, I was pretty psyched and a little thrilled when I caught writer guy checking me out. I'd worn the most manic pixie dream girl outfit I could think of. A plaid skirt, a beret, and some blouse or other I forget. Yes, I know I'm a cliche. Now wait until you find out that I'm an artist, but I'm a cool artist. I draw comics, nothing for the big two yet, but I have worked on a couple of titles from comic publishers you definitely have heard of. And at the time though, I was still building up my portfolio, so I was mostly doing sketches and perspective practices and poses and things, rather than Spider-Man punching the crap out of the Shocker. Dream panel to draw though. Anyways. Writer guy first approached me by casually passing by my table after buying his 3rd latte of the day. He pretended to tie his shoe and asked if I minded him placing the latte on the table. I said go ahead, it was no problem, and he said something about how he wouldn't want to spill his latte on my sketchbook. And then to his credit, he said something like, "I see you're an artist," instead of asking if I was, when he could see full well that I was an artist. And I told him that yeah, I was, and we ended up having an hour-long conversation about comics, still life, perspective, all sorts of things. And it was clear that he didn't know a ton about composition and the various nerdy details I was bringing up. But again, to his credit, he listened and seemed to pay attention without interrupting. When I was done talking, I asked him what kind of writer he was. Now here was where things got a little odd, because he was extremely cagey about it. I tried to flirtily coax the details from him, but all I could discover was that he wrote a combination of fact and fiction, meddled with metafiction, and was settling on a style. Now, over the next few weeks, we hung out every now and then at the coffee shop. Not for long, we both had work to do, but if we saw each other there, then we'd have a little chat. I appreciated that he wasn't the type of guy who'd make a note of my schedule and turn up exactly whenever I did. I don't know, I guess being terminally online left me on high alert for red flags. And yes, the Starbucks had free Wi-Fi, so I really was terminally online, and I just wasn't seeing any red flags at all. And it turns out that the reason that I wasn't seeing any small red flags was because the guy was just one giant walking, talking red flag, and I guess I was colorblind. Now, the more we talked, the more we learned about each other, which, thinking about it, isn't true at all. We learned about each other's artistic ambitions, writing and drawing, and I asked him some things about his life. He was currently between salaried jobs, living in his buddy's spare room trying to build a Twitch career in the evenings for if this writing thing didn't work out. And I remember him saying that he was a big fan of Moist Critical, and me telling him the word moist grossed me out, a word which he then used to tease me a lot. And I laughed throughout it, but in retrospect it was kind of weird. Like, yeah bro, my coffee is moist, the towelette is moist, I get it, you're trying to be flirty. And still a cave woman trying to headbutt the cave wall to create a shelf, I was too stupid to see any of the signs. I should add here, for anyone confused about the timelines, this went down in the summer of 2022. Starbucks had long since dropped their mandatory masking policy in most locations, and ours was one of them, thank God. I don't think I could have spent an entire day every day wearing those stupid things. Now, I didn't notice at the time, and looking back, I don't think Writer Guy really asked anything meaningful about me. I mean, there wasn't much to tell, but it would have been nice for him to show some interest in the degree that I'd studied. Surprisingly, nothing to do with art, an interesting story in and of itself, I think. Or what my family situation was. If I had siblings, one much older stepbrother and 3 sisters, one of whom at the time was basically an 18-year-old Karen. And he just showed no interest in my life outside of Starbucks other than my plans as an artist and career aspirations. Mostly he talked about how he wanted to get an agent, wanted to get a publishing deal, wanted to be the next big name in the literary world, etc., etc. Like, a lot, and repetitively. And you know what I decided at the time? I convinced myself that his shallow conversation was because he was building up to ask me out, and he was super awkward and shy about it. Yeah, the dude had no game, and that was pretty obvious, so latching onto the few things that we had in common, then repeating them, it made some sense to me. The dumbest part, at this stage I would have said yes if he just asked me out, and then I would have made sure that he found out more about me and vice versa. It had been a while since I dated, and thanks to the last couple of years, so I blame that for my bad judgment. Eventually I decided that if I was going to get some, I had to act. Even a movie date would do, and second base would be great. Third base would be more than enough, just literally anything. A date, a kiss, a modicum of interest from a guy who very clearly did find me attractive, considering how often I caught him checking me out. And I decided that the best way forward was to start being as flirty as I could with him without looking like a desperate, well, you know. And so one day, I had this great plan. Instead of buying our usual coffees from the counter so he'd see me come in, I drove through the drive-thru and bought our drinks that way. So when I entered the cafe, which thankfully didn't have a bell over the door, he wouldn't notice me as he sat writing facing my usual table, which was near the side window that looked out onto one particular street that I was fond of. I handled the door like a pro despite holding 2 coffees and crept up on Writer Guy. And the first thing I noticed was that there was actually text on the page. Now, maybe I'm the a-hole here because he always refused to tell me what he wrote because it wasn't ready, quote-unquote. But I couldn't help taking a peek before surprising him with the drinks. And what I saw made my jaw drop. And hey, I'm not a writer, so I'm not allowed to use dumb cliches like that, but I can't remember it word for word, obviously, but I do remember that he was writing in size 16 font or something ridiculous, which was extremely helpful. He was on chapter 5, and it began talking about how we'd established over the last chapters that by default, women are, well, words I can't really ask you to say on YouTube, and they're typically reserved for women of the night. And below that, he had written that he met a new girlfriend, and while she clearly was as loose as the others, she seemed to like him compared to other women. He had then written a screed about how, because he had me around his little finger, he could use my artistic talents to draw a comic he'd written, which would involve a character based on me who he could persuade to draw naked. Bonus points if I'd allow him to take reference photos. It was some kind of dramatically misguided pickup artist book coupled with an autobiography of how a loser like him had duped a hot chick like me. And I just stood there and read it all 3 times and then walked to the side of the table, placed his coffee down and told him that I bought this for him as a surprise. But that it turned out he was the one to surprise me. And at first he didn't understand what I meant until he saw me looking at the laptop screen. He slammed it closed and then started screaming that he hadn't given me permission to read his writing and that I was lacking the nuance and understanding to appreciate what he meant and various other things. He basically dug himself a 6-foot hole. The barista, who I also knew through his boyfriend, was a physio trainer and came over and asked if everything was okay. And this writer guy screamed that everything was not okay. I'd read his erotic fiction about me without his permission. Again, it was like he wanted to bury himself. And the barista told him that perhaps he'd better leave, while flexing his bicep in very much a type of I could throw you out if I wanted to, buddy type way. Now, writer guy snarked at him and then looked around frantically for something to do. He didn't want to just lose by leaving, and so he grabbed the coffee that I brought him and flung it against the Starbucks logo on the wall. And then, even more fired up, he screamed that I'd ruined everything. Shocking me and the barista, he grabbed up his expensive, new-looking MacBook Pro, I'm pretty sure it was a 16-inch too, and then flung it in anger against the tiled floor of that Starbucks. Now this laptop exploded into these weird pieces of glass and plastic and keyboard keys and circuitry, you name it. And then the writer's guy's eyes widened as if realizing what he'd done, and then he charged out the door, actively beginning to sob. The barista asked me if I wanted to call the cops or anything, but I didn't think it was really worth it. I told him I didn't know the guy's actual name even, but the barista replied that he did, from credit card receipts. And that was a relief at least in case things did escalate, but I was pretty sure they wouldn't. Well, I was wrong. I took a couple of weeks break from visiting that Starbucks just because I didn't like the idea of him spying on me from another store or anything like that, but eventually I was like, screw it. I'm not having my favorite place ruined by that thing. And when I entered, imagine my utter surprise when I saw who was sitting at the table facing my usual seat. Writer guy. And I looked over to the barista, and it was a young girl, maybe just out of high school, and I guess maybe there was no way to warn the other baristas who'd been banned. No security footage or visual footage or anything. And I decided that screw it, I wasn't leaving. I walked up to the counter, ordered my usual, and then told the barista that she might want to watch out for the guy by the door. I said that I had a bad experience with him and he'd been aggressive. She told me the manager didn't actually allow permabans of customers unless the cops had been involved, which explained that. And she also told me, though, that she'd gotten serious creeper vibes from him and how he'd openly stare at her breasts when he talked to her and how he reached out to touch her name badge before she pulled away. And I felt so stupid. How had I ignored all these strange things just because I found him cute? How had I even found him cute in the first place? Not accounting for taste, I suppose, and I guess mine at the time was wannabe PUA who pretends to be a sensitive nice guy. Sadly, a common trope in later years. And as I was heading to my table, writer guy called me over. I contemplated ignoring him, and I knew he was only going to come over to my table if I did, so I walked over there and he immediately started apologizing, groveling and begging, tears in his eyes, all sorts of stuff, and then he started begging me if we could pick up where we left off, because he was certain that an erotic graphic novel featuring the both of us would be a huge seller. Well, that had escalated, and now apparently he evolved into the eroticism as well. I told him that in no uncertain terms was I his girlfriend, and I'd never been his girlfriend. I'd never be writing a graphic novel with him, and I never wanted to see him again. And he just sat there in silence for a moment, and a tiny part of me hoped that he was genuinely thinking about his actions. Instead, he reached out for the brand new looking MacBook Pro that he'd been writing on. And please just take it and leave it, I thought. And I swear down that he had bought a replacement MacBook Pro, although at least it looked like a 14-incher this time, and now he was snatching that up. Now surely he wasn't going to. And with some shriek of anger, basically a howl, he slammed this new MacBook Pro down onto the floor of that Starbucks. And once again, the ridiculously expensive laptop exploded in a shower of debris and electronic crap. And the guy just stood there, breathing heavily and furiously for a second, and I thought maybe he was going to attack me. And instead, suddenly, it was like all the rage dissipated from his body as he looked down at the second shattered MacBook Pro on the floor. And then he let out a scream and ran out the door. I can't be sure, and maybe this is just cruel, wishful thinking, but I'm sure I heard him yell, "Not again, Mom's gonna kill me," or something before the door swung shut. I wouldn't be surprised. Now this time I did get the cops involved, just so that they were able to get him permanently banned from that Starbucks. And it was easy enough for the cops to consider his actions for the destruction of property, even though it was his own property, since the laptops also damaged some of the tiles, so he got banned, and I avoided a living red flag, and I still get to visit my favorite coffee place. Only now, I'm drawing comics for writers whose names you probably haven't heard of, and most definitely wouldn't treat me this way. And that's pretty sweet, all told, but the insanity that I experienced with that writer guy, holy crap. Maybe one day that could make for a comic book of its own. Maybe he was just on drugs. It was the summer of 1996. The world was in turmoil, probably, I can't quite remember. It's always in turmoil. And in truth, I can't remember much about 1996 except that I was 22 in my senior year of college, and I was dating someone named Rhea, the absolute hottest chick I have ever been with before or since, apart from my lovely wife, who, of course, makes my ex in question look like some swamp donkey. But honestly, and my wife has given me permission to say this because she knew Rhea too back in those days, this girl was ethereally beautiful. Delicate, elven features, strawberry blonde hair that caught the red in the afternoons and the blonde in the morning. She was stunning when I woke up next to her, even if after our first few nights together she'd jokingly freak out that I saw her without makeup. And she was the kind of girl who applied it in a way that the average dude would say that she didn't wear makeup at all. If I hadn't seen her spend an hour at the mirror painstakingly contouring her face in the most subtle manner, I would have thought that her beauty was entirely natural, and of course it was. She just amplified it in these gentle ways. And to call her a goddess feels wrong because she wasn't some kind of all-powerful being who commanded men and dominated a room. She was more like the most beautiful specter you've ever seen, or a fairy made human. At least, all of this was how she looked. As a person, she was kind of, let's just say, neurotic. She had specific things that she'd focus on. She wasn't autistic or anything like that, she just had weird things that she'd focus on. For example, if she wore a short skirt when we went out, she'd regularly ask me if she was accidentally flashing people. If I said no, it was just hanging just fine, then she'd just shrug and drop it. If I said that it was a bit windy so people might have seen a brief glimpse of the side of her underwear, she'd just shrug and drop it. She'd regularly ask me how many beers we had in the fridge, and if we had less than 4, she'd make me go on a grocery run to top it off to at least 6. And she didn't even drink beer. She collected CDs, but I don't think that I'd ever heard her listen to anything but the radio. Just these weird little quirks that for various reasons I'm pretty sure that she did deliberately because she was trying to be cute. It was the era of the quirky girl, and she'd often say things like, "I was born in the wrong era." But when I asked her what era she should have been born in, she'd think about it and then say, "This one, I guess." Now, I'm making her sound nuts, but this really was about 2% of her behavior. For the most part, we had a normal, healthy relationship. She liked going out for drinks and hanging with my friends, and she had one best friend who was also kinda hot, and while she was very friendly towards me, at the time I was convinced that she had a thing for Rhea. And my friends, who were all just regular guys around our age, were naturally kinda jealous that I'd hooked up with this elven princess. I was kind of the leader of that gang though, and I worked out a lot, and I think they all knew that I probably would have knocked them the F out if I'd caught them hitting on Rhea. And of course, her hot friend Cedar, yeah, apparently that's her real name, claimed to be married to a Russian in prison for murder. And she seemed to take great delight in shutting my friends down if they so much as put their arm around her. And plot twist, because it's not a very interesting way to end the story, Cedar was not in fact married to a Russian murderer, and that was just some crap Rhea made up, and Cedar is now my beautiful wife, with whom I have 2 beautiful children. Now anyway, with all that out of the way, back to Rhea's other main obsession, and this one did impact our relationship a decent amount. Rhea was absolutely obsessed with the idea of making money in the most unusual ways. She didn't want to get rich, she didn't care how much money she had, she just wanted to find money-making schemes that would get people talking. We were both fairly well off thanks to some inheritance and kind parents respectively, so it's not like she needed to focus on anything but grad school. And we were both studying various STEM subjects, and realistically it was a complete waste of time for either of us to go looking for work. But that wasn't what it was about for Rhea. She wanted to get paid, any kind of amount, for something unusual, and it was the strangest quirk I've maybe ever seen in a person. Now, for examples, she charged a local grocery store owner $10 to paint a huge, beautiful mural on the side of her store that pointed into the yard. And the creation of the mural and hiring a few people to help meant that she ended up at a loss of $190. She didn't care. She'd been paid $10 to paint a mural in the city, which is something very few people could claim. Another example, and okay, this one was kind of cool and I was a little jealous that she landed that job and I didn't. She spent one Halloween working as a murderous clown schoolgirl in a haunted house, where her sole job was to jump out, yell boo, giggle, and then run away. She took the job for $3 an hour and worked 10 hours a day for a week, and to her, that was a win. Finally, she hit me with the craziest idea yet. So, a week prior, we'd watched the movie Forrest Gump. She began the conversation by sort of coyly asking if I remembered the movie well, which obviously I did. It was the previous week. And I told her yes, and she replied saying the movie had given her an ideal money-making idea. I was expecting her to suggest some kind of walking initiative where people donated to her, or probably me, trailing behind, holding the donation bucket until she got bored. No, I couldn't have been more wrong. She asked me if I remembered the scene where Jenny, Forrest's one true love, plays guitar in the club. Now, I did remember it because it was kind of notable, obviously, and if you haven't seen the movie, she performs naked, and her nudity is covered up by the guitar. And so this was Rhea's plan. She was going to pitch the idea to small, artsy bars and clubs that she played raw acoustic songs, well, raw and naked. And this is someone who wouldn't wear a bikini to the beach and was only really comfortable showing off her legs, and certainly nothing above the waist or definitely between it. And even with me, she wasn't exactly the type to just stroll around the apartment nude, and after bedroom activities she almost scrambled to pull a robe on or something. And here she was, wanting to basically perform guitar pieces naked in front of a bunch of artsy strangers. And I tried to explain to her that it wasn't like the movie. They used clever cuts and camera angles to avoid the fact that Jenny could have almost certainly been seen totally naked by a number of patrons, not to mention the backstage people, etc. And Rhea told me that no, she was confident she could manage to pull it off without actually revealing her body to anyone. And I decided to just leave that and move on to asking her about the performance itself. And it turns out that she'd never tried to attempt to learn the guitar. I could play the guitar pretty well, actually, to the point that I was in a pretty amateurish unsigned band. And so, of course, I was roped into teaching her guitar. But she was hopeless. We practiced and practiced and practiced, and even though I kept advising her that she was over-practicing and making things harder, she was having none of it. And eventually she could successfully strum a G chord and occasionally switch from a G to a shaky C and then back again. And Rhea decided that this was enough for now, and she was on track to become a guitarist. And besides, acoustic performances were meant to be raw and simplistic. I wasn't prepared to argue this, so I just asked her to let me hear her sing. And I imagined that at least she was one of those girls who sang in her hairbrush in the mirror, and given how beautiful her speaking voice was, I was at least expecting something. Imagine a cat being strangled. Now imagine a cat being strangled while having a cactus shoved where no cactus should go. The sound that cat made would be melodic compared to Rhea's singing. I genuinely couldn't even work out what song she was attempting, and when she told me it was Patti Smith's song with a title I most certainly can't say on YouTube, you could have knocked me down with a butterfly. She asked me if she was as good as she'd been told and if she was ready to sing in bars. And I had two choices here. I could let my girlfriend have the most embarrassing night of her life, or I could tell her the truth and take the heat for a day or so. And I opted for the latter. And Rhea absolutely lost it. I'd never seen her behave like this before, not even close. And she began shrieking, just these noises aimed at nobody in particular, running her hands through her hair like she was shampooing it. And that's when she told me that she'd booked her first gig for 2 weeks from then. And it was at the local open mic basement bar run by one of our friends that we knew. We knew everyone there. Our friends hung out there. My ex, who was on great terms with, was the bartender, and this basically meant that not only would our entire friendship group see my girlfriend nude, no matter how convinced she was that she could keep herself covered, it also meant that they'd hear her acting like an absolute mental patient while taking herself completely seriously. I considered the idea of trying to persuade her to present it as comedy, or maybe even anti-comedy, or freaking something that wouldn't end in an unmitigated disaster. And I begged her to cancel it, and before I could even react, she grabbed up my old acoustic guitar that we'd been using to learn and smashed it over my head. No, it knocked me unconscious probably for like 10 seconds, I think. And I'm lucky as hell that my head is apparently very hard because it caused the strings to snap instead of cutting too deep into my scalp. There was blood though, and splinters that were dangerously close to my eyes and lips. I carefully stood up, holding my head downwards to make sure that I didn't get wood in my eyes, and this means that I missed Rhea's grand exit. And all I could hear was, "I'm leaving forever," and the door slamming behind her. Now, of course, she didn't leave forever. She had to awkwardly return a few days later to get some things, which took up about half the apartment. She tried apologizing to me, but it was the kind of apology where she clearly just wanted me to see her side. And along with that, she'd smashed my old acoustic guitar over my freaking head. That instrument had been inherited from my grandfather and had survived a number of middle school, high school, and college parties and bonfires. Don't worry though, I never played Wonderwall or Stairway. Now anyways, I essentially threw Rhea out and then time passed on. I had to visit the bar on the night of her supposed first performance just so I could try and stop it, but thankfully she wasn't there. Her friend, as you know, my now wife, Cedar, was there though, and it turns out we were both there to prevent Rhea from making a complete nude ass of herself, pun intended. Cedar and I drew closer over time, and I soon discovered that there was a side to Rhea that I'd never seen. Apparently, she'd been known as a queen bee mean girl in high school and had only befriended Cedar in college after Cedar had lost a bunch of weight and gotten hot. And some of the old stories that she told me about Rhea from high school were just downright deranged. For example, she performed a solo dance routine at the school talent show, changing her song and choreography at the last minute and then screaming at the audience when they didn't give her a standing ovation. She decided that certain girls, and even a few of the more docile boys, had slighted her in some way, so she'd go out of her way to sabotage them and get them into trouble while remaining sneaky clean. And when I asked Cedar why she'd become friends with Rhea and why she'd never warned any of us, she became quiet and introspective. Eventually, she admitted to me that she was a pretty devout Christian, and she believed in forgiveness and allowing people to change, and that Rhea had completely managed to convince her during college that she was a much better person. I couldn't blame her. I haven't even suspected this side of her. And shortly after, Cedar and I began dating, and as usual, we hung out with our friend group at that bar. It was open mic night, and who should take the stage but Rhea, clutching a tiny pink ukulele. Now, I was deeply relieved to find that she was fully clothed instead of trying to cover all of her most intimate bits with a tiny uke. Now, what followed was somehow even worse than the guitar performances. And by the end, even some of our friends were screaming to get off the stage and never come back. Cedar and I decided to sneak out the back door. Unfortunately, I froze when I heard Rhea scream my name, and she began screaming that I was the guy who sabotaged her music career. She claimed that I'd somehow made her bad at playing guitar, and she insisted that I tried to persuade her to perform nude, and what a creep this made me. And of course, most of my friends knew at least part of the story and knew it was all nonsense. And I just turned to leave, but Cedar shouted out for me to watch out. Rhea had hurled her little pink ukulele neck over head straight towards me, almost like a throwing axe. Now, thankfully, I was able to dodge the uke, which shattered into some pieces in one of the concrete pillars that held up the bar. I could see the fury in her eyes, though, and I knew it wasn't over. This time she grabbed a beer glass that was almost full, much to the anger of the guy who'd been about to take a sip from it, and she flung it, but of course she had no hope of hitting me from that distance. Now, that didn't stop our little military buddy Sid from stepping in the way of that glass anyways, though, and unfortunately it did hit him and shattered right into his face. I'd never seen anything like it. There were shards of glass everywhere, and some of them were even sticking out of Sid's cheek. One thin shard was pierced almost through his nose, and a sliver had gone right through his lip. Now, worse was the long, bloody piece that was a fraction of an inch below his eye socket. And you know what the goddamn legend did? He turned to me, he grinned, causing more blood to pour from his face, and said, "Told you I'd take a bullet for you one day." Now, thankfully, Sid didn't need any convincing. He just obviously pressed charges against Rhea, who quite clearly either had some kind of mental illness or severe anger management issues. And even though I don't quite agree, the courts ruled that she was perfectly sane to stand trial, and she spent 6 months in prison, 2 years on probation, and some fairly lengthy stint of anger management therapy when she came out. Naturally, Cedar and I also took a restraining order out against her, which was granted. No, I have no idea what's become of Rhea now, and I'm not sure I want to know. I'm a woman in my 20s, and I've been a long-time listener. I never had the guts to write this out before because I can't write to save my life, but I'll give it a go anyway. And you know what they say, you miss every shot you don't take. Now, I'm generally quite a mousy, quiet woman who keeps to herself. I work in a bookstore, and I like to listen to true crime podcasts, just like yours, and I watch Netflix. I'm really boring, and I'm not ashamed of that fact. I learned early on that excitement isn't always positive and isn't always what it's cracked up to be, and you can thank dear old mom and dad for that and the absolute pig-poo effort that they made in raising me. Thankfully, my older sister was there to make sure that I was always fed, cleaned, and that my clothes smelled at least relatively fresh. I love you, Audrey. I wouldn't have made it this far in life without you. Now, thankfully, this creepy story doesn't involve something terrible happening to my older sister, but it does once again show her looking out for her little brat kid sis. And when I was in middle school, I was the most awkward, gangly preteen you could possibly imagine. Actually a pretty short queen, but as I was growing up, my body felt like it was all arms and legs and elbows and knees. And my hair was a constant curly mess that I regularly burned with straighteners until Odd showed me how to actually use them. And oh yeah, I had braces and a retainer, and in high school, guess what? Acne. And it might seem like I'm being harsh on myself, but I was the ugly duckling. I'm actually pretty happy with how I look now, so I guess the years of suffering were worth it. There's a reason for this rambling, though. I'm sorry. During our first semester of our last year at middle school, one of the coolest boys in my year asked me out. Now, looking back, he was a complete try-hard emo, but he smoked behind the gym, and he wore a black trench coat, and he said the F word in front of the teachers. He was a rebel, and he told me that he wanted to be my boyfriend. At first, I said no because I thought that it had to be a prank. And it soon became clear that it wasn't though, and for 6 months, I dated the guy who I thought was the most badass guy in our year. And I'm pretty sure people laughed at him behind his back and to his face, but he always hid that from me, and I never stopped thinking that he was the coolest guy since the Fonz himself. Anyway, my cool emo boyfriend was named, or at least nicknamed, Cheese. And he never would tell me why, but he seemed to like the nickname and was cool with me calling him Cheese, and so I did. And then one day, without any warning, he told me that he was leaving school after the weekend and moving to a different state because his father had been reassigned to the New York office. I think he was a lawyer or a hedge manager or something like that. I thought Cheese was joking. He had a habit of teasing me with things like we are breaking up or so-and-so is dead, and he'd just seen the principal and our teacher doing it in the closet, and a baby popped out and looked at him, and that was a Simpsons joke, so I always remember that one. Turns out he wasn't kidding, and he simply never showed up to school on Monday. Didn't leave me some forwarding address, didn't call me, just completely ghosted me. Maybe that was the prank. Maybe he'd always known that he'd be leaving then. Jump forward 13 years. I'm sitting in my local coffee shop making use of their Wi-Fi when I get a Facebook friend request. Now it's from someone called Nathan Lester, and his profile picture is just some anime ninja. Now anyway, I didn't deny the friend request. I never got friend requests really, but I didn't accept it either. And when I clicked on his profile, I saw that we had 3 mutual friends, all from middle school. And a message request pinged, so I accepted it. Hi, it's Cheese from middle school. And that's when I realized Nathan Lester, Red Lester, is a kind of cheese especially popular over in the UK. That's probably how he got that nickname. We chatted on Facebook for a few days, and he was kind of very talky, reminiscing on old times that I'd barely even thought about or even remembered. And it worried me a little, but maybe he was just excited to reconnect with an old friend. Now, he had moved around the country due to his father's job after all, and I accepted his friend request and saw that he was a self-employed freelancer who'd graduated college. And despite feeling like a stalker, I went through all of his photos, which I couldn't find a single one of him. They were all animated characters, mostly anime, and a bunch of pictures of cats, which was adorable. And eventually he asked me if I wanted to meet him in a public place to catch up. And the fact that he specified a public place really put me, I guess, at ease. Some guys will wait for girls to suggest that just in case they can get us back to their apartments for a one-night stand. I suggested my local coffee shop, and to my surprise, he said that he was a regular too. I'd never seen him there, but I visited in the mornings. Maybe he was an afternoon guy. And when I showed up, I was the only customer in the cafe. I said hi to the employees, who I was vaguely friends with, and sat down. Now, I'm really going to try and be mean in the next part, but facts are facts. As I was drinking my coffee and reading my book, a short, portly man in cargo shorts and a t-shirt with holes in it sat down opposite me. I told him, as politely as I could, that I was waiting for someone, and he said something like, "Wait no more. Cheese is here." Well, darn. This was him. And when I spoke, I could see that most of his teeth looked disgusting. His skin was terribly unwashed and greasy, and he was balding in the way that had given himself a comb-over in this sort of monk's hairstyle. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with being bald. Most women actually find it pretty attractive, so if you do start losing your hair early, my advice is to not make yourself look like a serial killer. Now, we haven't even begun talking when Cheese told me that he needed a huge favor, and could I loan him $500 to pay off a credit card. He said that he'd be able to get me the money back in 6 months to a year. I told him I didn't remotely have the kind of money to lend him. Now, this wasn't entirely true, but profusely apologized, and deep down, I was pretty furious though. I gave him the benefit of the doubt because he started talking about our times in middle school like they were the best years of his life. And then it kind of made me sad when I realized that this might actually be true. Unfortunately, he ruined that when he kept referring to our meetup as a date, and then he told me that he'd never met another girl like me, and in fact, he'd never dated anyone since our little tryst in middle school. And believe it or not, we didn't even kiss, because I was the one for him, and we were destined to be together. Now, trying to be as pleasant as I could, I told him that I'd been under the impression that this was just a friendly catch-up. And then he asked if I'd dated anyone since him, which obviously yes, I had. And next came the, "Are you a virgin?" question. Oh my god, come on dude, I'm 25 and I just told you I had previous adult relationships. Do you really need to know if we did the deed? And here I lied and told him that I actually had a boyfriend now and that I didn't think that he'd be very happy with the way this meeting was going, so maybe I should just leave. He yelled something like, "Not if I leave first," and stormed out, leaving me with some bill for the various coffees and 3 expensive cakes that he'd ordered. As I was driving home, I called Audrey, or Officer Audrey as I teasingly called her, because, yeah, my older, protective sister had gone on to be a cop. And when I returned to my apartment, the ancient receptionist told me that a delivery man had taken a package up for me and then left. Now, this wasn't alarming by itself. I ordered from Amazon pretty often, and when I reached my hallway, I couldn't see any package on the ground, though. But what I did see was a replica ninja throwing star there and a dent in the door where someone had clearly tried and failed to stab it into the door as some type of threat. Instead, stuck next to the groove with a little sticky tack was a note that read, "I'll see you again." Of course, Officer Audrey absolutely refused to let me stay alone. She was currently living with her boyfriend, who I was pretty friendly with, so I assumed that I'd just sleep on the couch over there for a while. Audrey surprised me, though, by saying that she was coming to stay at my apartment. That way, if Cheese did try anything, then Big Sister Cop would be waiting for him. Now, after a few nights of Audrey sleeping at my place, we heard a banging on the door. It wasn't like a knocking, but a sound as if someone was trying to kick the door open. The door barely even shuddered, so the intruder wasn't exactly the most competent. Audrey called some of her on-duty buddies while I tried to listen through the door. Unfortunately, my apartment had been bust into during a SWAT raid before I moved in, and the door that they'd installed as a replacement didn't have a peephole. And sadly, I wasn't able to see whether this assailant was Cheese or if this was just some insane coincidence. Now, before I could really act, Audrey decided that she was bored of waiting for her backup and threw the door open inwards. Now, even though she shouldn't have because she was off duty, Audrey held up her gun. She didn't point it at the door kicker, she just held it up in that position that cops do. And it was Cheese at the door. All 300 sweaty, heavy-breathing pounds of him. And this wasn't my point of concern, though. My biggest concern was the large, thin sword that Cheese was holding over his shoulder like some kind of martial arts movie protagonist. Audrey shoved me out of the way, and Cheese brought that sword down hard on her shoulder. It cut into her flesh, but just the flesh, as this sword was clearly just some replica that Cheese had sharpened, and it wasn't a good replica either because it shattered into pieces as it caused the flesh wound on Aubrey's left shoulder. But, oh hell, you don't attack a cop with a sword, especially when 3 of her unit buddies burst into the hallway and tased the absolute crap out of Cheese. But not to be crude, but I mean that literally, he did in fact defecate himself during the tasing. And later, Audrey told me that that's not really something that happens from being tased, so he must have just soiled himself in fear from being charged by multiple cops and the realization that he just shattered his probably most expensive replica sword against a 4th cop's shoulder. The cops took Cheese in, and while Audrey tried to tell me about the night he spent in the cell, I didn't really want to hear it. I kind of felt bad for the guy because there was something clearly wrong with his head. And the way me and Odd had grown up, our horrible trailer park mother and her string of drug dealer boyfriends, I know that sometimes while you can come out the other side a better person, there are other times where you end up broken. And that's exactly what Cheese's lawyers managed to argue. He wasn't of sound mind and he wasn't fit to stand trial. His living conditions were almost untenable and he was deemed a vulnerable individual. And as such, it was ruled that he wasn't fit to stand trial and instead spent an unknown amount of time in some mental health facility. Now, this wasn't years ago, so for all I know, he's still there. It was sad that he suffered, but I'm still a tiny bit skeptical that he had zero responsibility for his actions. Up until our very last encounter, he seemed to know what he was doing and what his plans were. And the only plus side to the whole thing was that Audrey gets to tell people that she was sliced by a samurai sword. And if people ask me to share a fun fact about myself, I tell them that I once dated an evil ninja. I'm 44 now, and this all went down exactly 10 years ago. And as much as I adore my son, I did think that I was kind of resigned to a life as a single father. Now listeners, please don't crucify me, but in my experience, it's very hard for a single dad with a young male child to find a long-term partner. Maybe there's some scientific reason for this, or maybe I just get really unlucky, and I had it clear and visible on my profile that I had a wonderful 5-year-old son, and whenever I'd swipe right, they'd never swipe right back. Just for those worrying, he 100% knows that I don't blame him for this and never did. We've always been best friends, and he's an extremely smart kid. And on the rare occasions I did get a date, she almost always claimed that she didn't notice the sections where I had a son. Other times you could tell that she was gauging whether I'm hot enough to warrant raising somebody else's kid. No, was the answer apparently. Eventually, I gave up on dating apps and stopped bothering to look for a date at all. As it turns out, my son was staying with his grandparents one weekend, so me and my buddy Jesse decided to go bar hopping on a Friday night. Nothing crazy. We were 30-something-year-old men after all, and we certainly weren't going to hang out in clubs where the next oldest person was 22. But there's a surprisingly large amount of nightlife for the 30 to 40-year-olds in Chicago, and we found ourselves having a lot of fun. More than we'd expected. Now, eventually I met a woman who said that she was 28 and looked it too, and actually was. Sometimes people lie about their ages in places like this, but why bother? We all look and act our age, even if some age differently than others. Now, we ended up getting a little bit drunk and taking a taxi home. I was a gentleman and offered her my bed while I slept on the couch. Main rule, no drunken sex with someone I'm not married to. And the next day, we both woke up with hangovers and spent the whole day together. And I won't bore you with the details of our courtship, let's just jump to the important stuff. And the woman's name was Sheila. She'd moved in and served as the sort of surrogate mother to my son. And at first, everything was fine. She'd watch him sometimes, help with his homework, do a small share of chores that I used to do as a single dad. And eventually, though, she stopped doing really any of that. She wasn't looking for a job, and I was pretty much paying for everything. And she persuaded me to take a credit card out for us, which, against my better judgment, I did, not even questioning why she wasn't eligible herself. And I guess I was just, I don't know. She was in her 20s, attractive, I was in my 30s. She had a good relationship with my boy, and our intimate life was incredible. Who cared if she left a dish or plate or two lying around the house? It did start to grind me down though, and when Christmas came, I realized that I'd have to borrow some money from my parents in order to be able to fully afford the item that my son wanted. I forgot what it was now, but we'll just pretend it's something really cool. It was mid-November when she broke the final straw. I came home to hear her yelling at my son that he was lazy and stupid for getting a B in English. I discussed with her multiple times that I had issues with his English teacher and her teaching methods, and that my son wasn't to be punished for a less than perfect grade in the subject. And yet here she was, yelling at him, telling him that Santa would be spending his money on Christmas presents for her instead. And then she threatened to smack his butt when he responded with, "You're not my mom." Now, if there's one thing I don't stand for is corporal punishment and threats of violence against my kid. And I stormed in and told Sheila to just leave. Now, she looked at me like she'd just come out of a trance, and then, to much to my surprise, she agreed. She said it was for the best. She just asked if she could have until the weekend to pack all of her stuff together, which seemed reasonable. She'd fully moved in, so she had to fully move out as well. And that afternoon I was working in my office, and I've been able to do more remote work since Sheila, but I typically work from home so I could parent the boy. and I heard the front door opening, some muffled voices and shuffling, and then the door slamming shut. Eventually, I ended the call I was on and made it out into the apartment and saw it was empty and ran into the parking lot. I could see Sheila speeding up in her beat-up junker, and I could see my kid looking through the back window, tears streaming down his face. Immediately, I had to develop a plan. I'd get into my own car, chase Sheila, and drive erratically so the cops pulled me over and I could quickly tell them the situation. I knew I'd have to be careful because this wasn't exactly the quiet part of inner Chicago, and I didn't want to save my son but send some poor baby in a stroller to fly across the street in a deadly impact. And so I think my erratic driving, especially given my profession, more on that later, was more like slight misdemeanors than anything else. I followed Sheila around various corners, swerving around parked cars, speeding, trying to be as safe as possible. And the frustrating thing is, I caught sight of some cop cars a block over, but they didn't seem interested in me. I drove up, following Sheila, and saw the two cop cars and a van had her trapped in a street with another cop car blocking her from reversing. When I saw a female cop hugging my son, I dived out of the car and ran to him. He yelled "Daddy" in these excited tears, so the cops immediately knew to let me through. It turns out that two Chicago PD officers had both clocked me driving erratically and actually knew me. Now, I'm a stay-at-home prosecutor, so I'm not some stranger to a handful of cops. This pair knew that something had to be wrong, so they put a call out for any vehicle that a car with my registration might be pursuing, explaining that I was a junior prosecutor. A helicopter patrol easily identified Sheila's car as being the one that I was following, and they also ran a check and saw that she had multiple outstanding parking tickets in Chicago and a warrant in Iowa that they weren't willing to disclose. Later, I tried accessing her fine, but they'd restricted my access, but fair enough. Now, reunited with my son, I'd never been more happy or more scared. I realized then that losing him would be the most upsetting, devastating thing in my life. He just yelled, "Don't be lame, Dad," from the other side of the room, so I know I'm parenting right. And Sheila was charged with child endangerment and a series of other minor misdemeanors. Obviously, I wasn't allowed to serve as a prosecutor on the case for obvious reasons, but I wish I had. Her lawyers had managed to argue Sheila's way out of a kidnapping charge, and I'm still not happy about that. When she's released, though, she's being sent to Iowa to face whatever mysterious warrant she has waiting for her there. Like I said, I'm 44 now and I haven't dated since Sheila, and frankly, I don't want to. I have family and friends, and nobody could replace my boy's mom anyway, even though he sadly never got to know her as she